Section 24 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 17, showing that the French people were excited to revolt by the means taken to relieve them. As the common people of France had not appeared for one single moment on the theatre of public affairs for upwards of 140 years, no one any longer imagined that they could ever again resume their position. They appeared unconscious and were therefore believed to be deaf. Accordingly, those who began to take an interest in their condition talked about them in their presence, just as if they had not been there. It seemed as if these remarks could only be heard by those who were placed above the common people, and that the only danger to be apprehended was that they might not be fully understood by the upper classes. The very men who had most to fear from the fury of the people declaimed loudly in their presence on the cruel injustice under which the people had always suffered. They pointed out to each other the monstrous vices of those institutions which had weighed most heavily upon the lower orders. They employed all their powers of rhetoric in depicting the miseries of the common people and their ill-paid labor, and thus they infuriated while they endeavored to relieve them. I do not speak of the writers, but of the government, of its chief agents, and of those belonging to the privileged class itself. When the king, 13 years before the Revolution, tried to abolish the use of compulsory labor, he said in the preamble to this decree, "With the exception of a small number of provinces, the pays d'etat, almost all the roads throughout the kingdom have been made by the gratuitous labor of the poorest part of our subjects. Thus the whole burden has fallen on those who possess nothing but their hands, and who are interested only in a secondary degree in the existence of roads. Those really interested are the landowners, nearly all privileged persons whose estates are increased in value by the construction of roads. By forcing the poor to keep them up unaided, and by compelling them to give their time and labor without remuneration, they are deprived of their sole resource against want and hunger, because they are made to labor for the profit of the rich." When, at the same period, an attempt was made to abolish the restrictions which the system of trading companies or guilds imposed on artisans, it was proclaimed in the king's name that the right to work is the most sacred of all possessions, that every law by which it is infringed violates the natural rights of man, and is null and void in itself, that the existing corporations are moreover grotesque and tyrannical institutions, the result of selfishness, avarice, and violence. Such words as these were dangerous, no doubt, but what was infinitely more so was that they were spoken in vain. A few months later, the corporations and the system of compulsory labor were again established. It is said that Turgot was the minister who put this language into the king's mouth, but most of Turgot's successors made him hold no other. When, in 1780, the king announced to his subjects that the increase of the taille would for the future be subject to public registration, he took care to add, by way of commentary, "Those persons who are subject to the taille, besides being harassed by the vexations incident to its collection, have likewise hitherto been exposed to unexpected augmentations of the tax, insomuch that the contributions paid by the poorest part of our subjects have increased in a much greater proportion than those paid by all the rest." When the king, not yet venturing to place all the public burdens on an equal footing, attempted at least to establish equality of taxation in those which were already imposed on the middle class, he said, "His Majesty hopes that rich persons will not consider themselves aggrieved by being placed on the common level, and made to bear their part of a burden which they ought long since to have shared more equally." But it was above all at periods of scarcity that nothing was left untried to inflame the passions of the people far more than to provide for their wants. In order to stimulate the charity of the rich, one intendant talked to the injustice and insensibility of those landowners who owe all they possess to the labors of the poor, and who let them die of hunger at the very moment they are toiling to augment the returns of landed property. The king, too, thus expressed himself on a similar occasion. His Majesty is determined to defend the people against manoeuvres which expose them to the want of the most needful food, by forcing them to give their labor at any price that the rich choose to bestow. The king will not suffer one part of his subjects to be sacrificed to the avidity of the other. Until the very end of the monarchy, the strife which subsisted among the different administrative powers gave occasion for all sorts of demonstrations of this kind. The contending parties readily imputed to each other the miseries of the people. A strong instance of this appeared in the quarrel which arose in 1772 between the Parliament of Toulouse and the king, with reference to the transport of grain. The government, by its bad measures, places the poor in danger of dying of hunger, said the Parliament. The ambition of the Parliament and the avidity of the rich are the cause of the general distress, retorted the king. Thus both the parties were endeavoring to impress the minds of the common people with the belief that their superiors are always to blame for their sufferings. These things are not contained in the secret correspondence of the time, but in public documents, which the government and the parliaments themselves took care to have printed and published by thousands. The king took occasion, incidentally, to tell very harsh truths both to his predecessors and to himself. The treasure of the state, said he on one occasion, has been burdened by the lavish expenditure of several successive reigns. Many of our inalienable domains have been granted on leases at nominal rents. On another occasion he was made to say, with more truth than prudence, the privileged trading companies mainly owed their origin to the fiscal avidity of the crown. Farther on he remarked that if useless expenses have often been incurred, and if the taille has increased beyond all bounds, it has been because the Board of Finance found an increase of the taille the easiest resource, inasmuch as it was clandestine, and was therefore employed, although many other expedients would have been less burdensome to our people. All this was addressed to the enlightened part of the nation in order to convince it of the utility of certain measures which private interests rendered unpopular. As for the common people, it was assumed that if they listened they did not understand. It must be admitted that at the bottom of all these charitable feelings there remained a strong bias of contempt for these wretched beings whose miseries the higher classes so sincerely wished to relieve, and that we are somewhat reminded by this display of compassion of the notion of Madame du Châtelet, who, as Voltaire's secretary tells us, did not scruple to undress herself before her attendants, not thinking it by any means proved that lackeys are men. And let it not be supposed that Louis XVI or his ministers were the only persons who held the dangerous language which I have just cited. The privileged persons, who were about to become the first object of the popular fury, expressed themselves in exactly the same manner before their inferiors. It must be admitted that in France the higher classes of society had begun to pay attention to the condition of the poor before they had any reason to fear them. They interested themselves in their fate at a time when they had not begun to believe that the sufferings of the poor were the precursors of their own perdition. This was peculiarly visible in the 10 years which preceded 1789. The peasants were the constant objects of compassion. Their condition was continually discussed. The means of affording them relief were examined. The chief abuses from which they suffered were exposed, and the physical laws which pressed most heavily upon them were condemned. But the manner in which this new-born sympathy was expressed was as imprudent as the long-continued insensibility which had preceded it. If we read the reports of the provincial assemblies, which met in some parts of France in 1779 and subsequently throughout the kingdom, and if we study the other public records left by them, we shall be touched by the generous sentiments expressed in them and astonished at the wonderful imprudence of the language in which they are expressed. The Provincial Assembly of Lower Normandy said in 1787, "We have too frequently seen the money destined by the king for roads serve only to increase the prosperity of the rich without any benefit to the people. It has often been employed to embellish the approach to a country mansion instead of making a more convenient entrance to a town or village." In the same assembly, the orders of nobility and clergy, after describing the abuses of compulsory labor, spontaneously offered to contribute out of their own funds 50,000 livres towards the improvement of the roads, in order, as they said, that the roads of the province might be made practicable without any further cost to the people. It would probably have cost these privileged classes less to abolish the compulsory system and to substitute for it a general tax from which they should pay their quota, but though willing to give up the profit derived from inequality of taxation, they liked to maintain the appearance of the privilege. While they gave up that part of their rights which was profitable, they carefully retained that which was odious. Other assemblies, composed entirely of landowners, except from the taille, and who fully intended to continue so, nevertheless depicted in the darkest colors the hardships which the taille inflicted on the poor. They drew a frightful picture of all its abuses, which they circulated in all directions, but the most singular part of the affair is that to these strong marks of the interest they felt in the common people, they from time to time added public expressions of contempt for them. The people had already become the object of their sympathy without having ceased to be the object of their disdain. The Provincial Assembly of Upper Guyenne, speaking of the peasants whose cause they so warmly pleaded, called them coarse and ignorant creatures, turbulent spirits, and rough and intractable characters. Turgot, who did so much for the people, seldom spoke of them otherwise. These harsh expressions were used in acts intended for the greatest publicity and meant to meet the eyes of the peasants themselves. It seemed as though the framers of them imagined that they were living in a country like Galicia, where the higher classes speak a different language from the lower, and cannot be understood by them. The feudalists of the 18th century, who frequently displayed towards their ratepayers and others who owed them feudal services a disposition to indulgence, moderation, and justice unknown to their predecessors, still spoke occasionally of vile peasants. These insults seem to have been in proper form, as the lawyers say. The nearer we approach towards 1789, the more lively and imprudent does this sympathy with the hardships of the common people become. I have held in my hands the circulars addressed by several provincial assemblies in the very beginning of 1788 to the inhabitants of the different parishes, calling upon them to state in detail all the grievances of which they might have to complain. One of these circulars is signed by an abbé, a great lord, 3 nobles, and a man of the middle class, all members of the assembly and acting in its name. This committee directed the syndic of each parish to convoke all the peasants and to inquire of them what they had to say against the manner in which the various taxes which they paid were assessed and collected. We are generally aware, they say, that most of the taxes, especially the gabelle and the taille, have disastrous consequences for the cultivators, but we are anxious to be acquainted with every single abuse. The curiosity of the Provincial Assembly did not stop there. It investigated the number of persons in the parish enjoying any privileges with respect to taxes, whether nobles, ecclesiastics, or roturiers, and the precise nature of these privileges, the value of the property of those thus exempted, whether or not they resided on their estates, whether there was much church property, or, as the phrase then was, land in mortmain, which was out of the market, and its value. All this even was not enough to satisfy them. They wanted to be told the share of duties, taille, additional dues, poll tax, and forced labor rate, which the privileged class would have to pay, supposing equality of taxation existed. This was to inflame every man individually by the catalogue of his own grievances. It pointed out to him the authors of his wrongs, emboldened him by showing him how few they were in number, and fired his heart with cupidity, envy, and hatred. It seemed as if the Jacquerie, the Maillotins, and the 16 were totally forgotten, and that no one was aware that the French people, which is the quietest and most kindly disposed in the world, so long as it remains in its natural frame of mind, becomes the most barbarous as soon as it is roused by violent passions. Unfortunately, I have not been able to procure all the returns sent in by the peasants in reply to these fatal questions, but I have found enough to show the general spirit which pervaded them. In these reports the name of every privileged person, whether of the nobility or the middle class, is carefully mentioned. His mode of life is frequently described, and always in an unfavorable manner. The value of his property is curiously examined. The number and extent of his privileges are insisted on at length, and especially the injury they do to all the other inhabitants of the village. The bushels of corn which have to be paid to him as dues are reckoned up. His income is calculated in an envious tone, an income by which no one profits, they say. The casual dues of the parish priest, his stipend, as it was already called, are pronounced to be excessive. It is remarked with bitterness that everything at church must be paid for, and that a poor man cannot even get buried gratis. As to the taxes, they are all unfairly assessed and oppressive. Not one of them finds favor, and they are all spoken of in a tone of violence which betrays exasperation. The indirect taxes are detestable, they say. There is not a household in which the clerk of the excise does not come and search. Nothing is sacred from his eyes and hands. The registration dues are crushing. The collector of the tithe is a tyrant, whose rapacity leads him to avail himself of every means of harassing the poor. The bailiffs are no better. No honest farmer can be secured from their ferocity. The collectors are forced to ruin their neighbors in order to avoid exposing themselves to the voracity of these despots. The revolution not only announces its approach in this inquiry, it is already there, speaking its own proper language and showing its face without disguise. Amid all the differences which exist between the religious revolution of the 16th century and the French Revolution of the 18th, one contrast is peculiarly striking. In the 16th century, most of the great nobles changed their religion from motives of ambition and cupidity, the people, on the contrary, from conviction and without any hope of profit. In the 18th century, the reverse was the case. Disinterested convictions and generous sympathies then agitated the enlightened classes and incited them to revolution, while a bitter feeling of their wrongs and an ardent desire to alter their position excited the common people. The enthusiasm of the former put the last stroke to inflaming and arming the rage and the desires of the latter. End of section 24. Section 25 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 18. Concerning some practices by which the government completed the revolutionary education of the people of France. The government itself had long been at work to instill into and rivet upon the mind of the common people many of the ideas which have been called revolutionary, ideas hostile to individual liberty, opposed to private rights, and favorable to violence. The king was the first to show with how much contempt it was possible to treat the most ancient and apparently the best established institutions. Louis XV shook the monarchy and hastened the revolution quite as much by his innovations as by his vices, by his energy as by his indolence. When the people beheld the fall and disappearance of a parliament almost contemporary with the monarchy itself, and which had until then seemed as immovable as the throne, they vaguely perceived that they were drawing near a time of violence and of chance, when everything may become possible, when nothing, however ancient, is respected, and nothing, however new, may not be tried. During the whole course of his reign, Louis XVI did nothing but talk of reforms to be accomplished. There are few institutions of which he did not foreshadow the approaching ruin before the Revolution came to effect it. After removing from the statute book some of the worst of these institutions, he very soon replaced them. It seemed as if he wanted only to loosen their roots, leaving to others the task of striking them down. By some of the reforms which he effected himself, ancient and venerable customs were suddenly changed without sufficient preparation, and established rights were occasionally violated. These reforms prepared the way for the Revolution, not so much by overthrowing the obstacles in its way, as by showing the people how to set about making it. The evil was increased by the very purity and disinterestedness of the intentions which actuated the king and his ministers, for no example is more dangerous than that of violence exerted for a good purpose by honest and well-meaning men. At a much earlier period, Louis XIV had publicly broached in his edicts the theory that all the land throughout the kingdom had originally been granted conditionally by the state, which was thus declared to be the only true landowner, and that all others were possessors whose titles might be contested and whose rights were imperfect. This doctrine had arisen out of the feudal system of legislation, but it was not proclaimed in France until feudalism was dying out, and was never adopted by the courts of justice. It is, in fact, the germ of modern socialism, and it is curious enough to see it first springing up under royal despotism. During the reigns which followed that of Louis XIV, the administration day by day instilled into the people, in a manner still more practical and comprehensible, the contempt in which private property was to be held. When during the latter half of the 18th century the taste for public works, especially for roads, began to prevail, the government did not scruple to seize all the land needed for its undertakings, and to pull down the houses which stood in the way. The French Board of Works was already just as enamored of the geometrical beauty of straight lines as it has been ever since. It carefully avoided following the existing roads if they were at all crooked, and rather than make the slightest deviation, it cut through innumerable estates. The ground thus damaged or destroyed was never paid for, but an arbitrary rate, and after long delay, or frequently not at all. When the Provincial Assembly of Lower Normandy took the administration out of the hands of the intendant, it was discovered that the price of all the land seized by authority in the preceding 20 years for making roads was still unpaid. The debt thus contracted by the state and not discharged in this small corner of France amounted to 250,000 livres. The number of large proprietors thus injured was limited, but the small ones who suffered were very numerous, for even then the land was much subdivided. Every one of these persons had learnt by his own experience how little respect the rights of an individual can claim when the interest of the public requires that they should be invaded, a doctrine which he was not likely to forget when the time came for applying it to others for his own advantage. In a great number of parishes, charitable endowments had formerly existed, destined by their founders to relieve the inhabitants in certain cases and in conformity to testamentary bequest. Most of these endowments were destroyed during the later days of the monarchy, or diverted from their original objects by mere orders in council, that is to say, by the arbitrary act of government. In most instances, the funds thus left to particular villages were taken from them for the benefit of neighboring hospitals. At the same time, the property of these hospitals was in its turn diverted to purposes which the founder had never had in view and would undoubtedly not have approved. An edict of 1780 authorized all these establishments to sell the lands which had been devised to them at various times to be held by them for ever, and permitted them to hand over the purchase money to the state, which was to pay the interest upon it. This, they said, was making a better use of the charity of their forefathers than they had done themselves. They forgot that the surest way of teaching mankind to violate the rights of the living is to pay no regard to the will of the dead. The contempt displayed by the administration of the old French monarchy for testamentary dispositions has never been surpassed by any succeeding power. Nothing could be more unlike the scrupulous anxiety which leads the English to invest every individual citizen with the force of the whole social body in order to assist him in maintaining the effect of his last dispositions, and which induces them to pay even more respect to his memory than to himself. Compulsory requisitions, the forced sale of provisions, and the maximum are measures not without their precedents under the old monarchy. I have discovered instances in which the officers of government, during periods of scarcity, fixed beforehand the price of the provisions which the peasants brought to market, and when the latter stayed away from fear of this constraint, ordinances were promulgated to compel them to come under penalty of a fine. But nothing taught a more pernicious lesson than some of the forms adopted by criminal justice when the common people were in question. The poor were even then far better protected than has generally been supposed against the aggressions of any citizen richer or more powerful than themselves. But when they had to do with the state, they found only, as I have already described, exceptional tribunals, prejudiced judges, a hasty and illusory procedure, and a sentence executed summarily and without appeal. The provost of the constables and his lieutenant are to take cognizance of the disturbances and gatherings which may be occasioned by the scarcity of corn. The prosecution is to take place in due form, and judgment to be passed by the provost and without appeal. His Majesty inhibits the jurisdiction of all courts of justice in these cases. We learn by the reports of the constables that on these occasions suspected villages were surrounded during the night, that houses were entered before daybreak, and peasants who had been denounced were arrested without further warrant. A man thus arrested frequently remained for a long time in prison before he could speak to his judge, although the edicts directed that every accused person should be examined within 24 hours. This regulation was as precise and as little respected then as it is now. By these means, a mild and stable government daily taught the people the code of criminal procedure most appropriate to a period of revolution, and best adapted to arbitrary power. These lessons were constantly before their eyes, and to the very last the old monarchy gave the lower classes this dangerous education. Even Turgot himself in this respect faithfully imitated his predecessors. When, in 1775, his change in the corn laws occasioned resistance in the Parliament and disturbances in the rural districts, he obtained a royal ordinance transferring the mutineers from the jurisdiction of the tribunals to that of the provost marshal, which is chiefly destined, so the phrase runs, to repress popular tumults when it is desirable that examples should be quickly made. Nay, worse than this, every peasant leaving his parish without being provided with a certificate signed by the parish priest and by the syndic was to be prosecuted, arrested, and tried before the provost marshal as a vagabond. It is true that under this monarchy of the 18th century, though the forms of procedure were terrific, the punishment was almost always light. The object was to inspire fear rather than to inflict pain, or rather perhaps those in power were violent and arbitrary from habit, or from the indifference, and mild by temperament. But this only increased the taste for this summary kind of justice. The lighter the penalty, the more readily was the manner forgotten in which it had been pronounced. The mildness of the sentence served to veil the horror of the mode of procedure. I may venture to affirm from the facts I have in my possession that a great number of the proceedings adopted by the revolutionary government had precedents and examples in the measures taken with regard to the common people during the last 2 centuries of the monarchy. The monarchy gave to the revolution many of its forms, the latter only added to them the atrocity of its own spirit. End of section 25. Section 26 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 19, showing that the great administrative revolution had preceded the political revolution and what were the consequences it produced. Nothing had yet been changed in the form of the French government, but already the greater part of the secondary laws which regulated the condition of persons and the administration of affairs had been abolished or modified. The destruction of the guilds, followed by their partial and incomplete restoration, had totally changed all the old relations between workmen and their employers. These relations had become not only different, but uncertain and difficult. The police of the masters was at an end, the authority of the state over the trades was imperfectly established, and the artisan placed in a constrained and undecided position between the government and his employer did not know to whom he was to look for protection or from whom he was to submit to restraint. This state of discontent and anarchy, into which the whole lower class of the towns had been plunged at one blow, produced very great consequences as soon as the people began to reappear on the political stage. 1 year before the Revolution, a royal edict had disturbed the order of the administration of justice in all its parts. Several new jurisdictions had been created, a multitude of others abolished, and all the rules of judicial competence changed. Now, in France, as I have already shown, the number of persons engaged in administering justice and in executing the sentences of the law was enormous. In fact, it may be said that the whole of the middle class was more or less connected with the tribunals. The effect of this law, therefore, was to unsettle the station and property of thousands of families and to place them in a new and precarious position. The edict was little less inconvenient to litigants, who found it difficult in the midst of this judicial revolution to discover what laws were applicable to their cases and by what tribunals they were to be decided. But it was the radical reform which the administration, properly so called, underwent in 1787, which more than all the rest first threw public affairs into disorder and shook the private existence of every individual citizen. I've already mentioned that in what were termed the pays d'élection, that is to say, in about 3/4 of France, the whole administration of each district was abandoned to one man, the intendant, who acted not only without control but without advice. In 1787, in addition to the intendant, a provincial assembly was created, which assumed the real administration of the country. In each village, an elective municipal body likewise took the place of the ancient parochial assemblies and in most cases of the syndic. A state of the law so opposed to that which had preceded it, and which so completely changed not only the whole course of affairs, but the relative position of persons, was applied in all places at the same moment and almost in the same manner, without the slightest regard to previous usages or to the peculiar situation of each province. So fully had the passion for unity which characterized the Revolution taken possession of the ancient government which the Revolution was about to destroy. These changes serve to display the force of habit in the action of political institutions and to show how much easier it is to deal with obscure and complicated laws which have long been in use than with a totally new system of legislation, however simple. Under the old French monarchy, there existed all sorts of authorities which varied almost infinitely according to the provinces. But as none of these authorities had any fixed or definite limits, the field of action of each of them was always common to several others besides. Nevertheless, affairs had come to be transacted with a certain regularity and convenience, whereas the newly established authorities, which were fewer in number, carefully circumscribed and exactly similar, instantly conflicted and became entangled in hopeless confusion, frequently reducing each other mutually to impotence. Moreover, the new law had one great vice, which in itself would have sufficed, especially at first, to render it difficult of execution. All the powers it created were collective or corporate. Under the old monarchy there had been only two methods of administration. Where the administration was entrusted to one man, he acted without the assistance of any assembly. Wherever assemblies existed, as in the Pays d'État, or in the towns, the executive power was not vested in any particular person. The assembly not only governed and superintended the administration, but administered itself or by means of temporary commissions which it appointed. As these were the only two modes of operation which were then understood, when one was given up, the other was adopted. It is strange that in the midst of a community so enlightened, and where the administration of the government had long played so prominent a part, no one ever thought of uniting the two systems and of drawing a distinction without making a separation between the power which has to execute and that which superintends and directs. This idea, which appears so simple, never occurred to anyone. It was not discovered until the present century, and may be said to be the only great invention in the field of public administration which we can claim. We shall see, however, hereafter the results of the contrary practice when these administrative habits were transferred to political life, and when, in obedience to the traditions of the old institutions of the monarchy, hated as they were, the system which had been followed by the provincial estates and the small municipalities of the towns was applied in the National Convention, and the causes which had formerly occasioned a certain embarrassment in the transaction of business suddenly engendered the reign of terror. The provincial assemblies of 1787 were invested with the right of governing themselves in most of the cases in which, until then, the intendant had acted alone. They were charged under the authority of the central government with the assessment of the taille and with the superintendence of its collection, with the power of deciding what public works were to be undertaken, and with their execution. All the persons employed in public works, from the inspector down to the driver of the road gang, were under their control. They were to order what they thought proper, to render an account of the services performed to the minister, and to suggest to him the fitting remuneration. The parochial trusts were almost entirely placed under the direction of these assemblies. They were to decide, in the first instance, most of the litigated matters which had until then been tried before the intendant. Many of these functions were unsuitable for a collective and irresponsible body, and moreover they were to be performed by men who were now for the first time to take a part in the administration. The confusion was made complete by depriving the intendant of all power, though his office was not suppressed. After taking from him the absolute right of doing everything, he was charged with the task of assisting and superintending all that was to be done by the assembly, as if it were possible for a degraded public officer to enter into the spirit of the law by which he has been dispossessed and to assist its operation. That which had been done to the intendant was now extended to his sub-delegate. By his side, and in the place which he had formerly occupied, was placed a district assembly, which was to act under the direction of the provincial assembly and upon analogous principles. All that we know of the acts of the provincial assemblies of 1787, and even their own reports, show that as soon as they were created, they engaged in covert hostilities, and often in open war with the intendants, who made use of their superior experience only to embarrass the movements of their successors. Here an assembly complained that it was only with difficulty that it could extract the most necessary documents from the hands of the intendant. There an intendant accused the members of the Assembly of endeavoring to usurp functions which, as he said, the edicts had still left to himself. He appealed to the minister, who often returned to no answer or merely expressed doubts, for the subject was as new and as obscure to him as to everyone else. Sometimes the Assembly resolved that the intendant had administered badly, that the roads which he had caused to be made were ill planned or ill kept up, and that the corporate bodies under his trust have gone to ruin. Frequently these assemblies hesitated in the obscurity of laws so imperfectly known. They sent great distances to consult one another, and constantly sent each other advice. The intendant of Alc asserted that he had the right to oppose the will of the provincial assembly, which had authorized a parish to tax itself. The Assembly maintained that this was a subject on which the intendant could no longer give orders, but only advice, and it asked the Assembly of the Ile-de-France for its opinion. Amidst all these recriminations and consultations, the course of administration was impeded and often altogether stopped. The vital functions of the country seemed almost suspended. The stagnation of affairs is complete, says the Provincial Assembly of Lorraine, which in this was only the echo of several others, and all good citizens are grieved at it. On other occasions these new governing bodies erred on the side of over-activity and excessive self-confidence. They were filled with a restless and uneasy zeal, which led them to seek to change all the old methods suddenly, and hastily to reform all the most ancient abuses. Under the pretext that henceforth they were to be the guardians of the towns, they assumed the control of municipal affairs. In a word, they put the finishing stroke to the general confusion by aiming at universal improvement. Now, when we consider what an immense space the administrative powers of the state had so long filled in France, the numerous interests which were daily affected by them, and all that depended upon them or stood in need of their cooperation, when we reflect that it was to the government rather than to themselves that private persons looked for the success of their own affairs, for the encouragement of their manufactures, to ensure their means of subsistence, to lay out and keep up their roads, to maintain their tranquillity, and to preserve their wealth, we shall have some idea of the infinite number of people who were personally injured by the evils from which the administration of the kingdom was suffering. But it was in the villages that the defects of the new organization were most strongly felt. In them it not only disturbed the course of authority, it likewise suddenly changed the relative position of society and brought every class into collision. When in 1775 Turgot proposed to the king to reform the administration of the rural districts, the greatest difficulty he encountered, as he himself informs us, arose from the unequal incidence of taxation. For how was it possible to make men who were not all liable to contribute in the same manner, and some of whom were altogether exempt from taxation, act and deliberate together on parochial affairs relating chiefly to the assessment and the collection of those very taxes and the purposes to which they were to be applied? Every parish contained nobles and the clergy who did not pay the taille, peasants who were partially or wholly exempt, and others who paid it all. It was as three distinct parishes, each of which would have demanded a separate administration. The difficulty was insoluble. Nowhere, indeed, was the inequality of taxation more apparent than in the rural districts. Nowhere was the population more effectually divided into different groups, frequently hostile to one another. In order to make it possible to give to the villages a collective administration and a free government on a small scale, it would have been necessary to begin by subjecting all the inhabitants to an equal taxation and lessening the distance by which the classes were divided. This was not, however, the course taken when the reform was begun in 1787. Within each parish the ancient distinction of classes was maintained, together with the inequality of taxation, which was its principal token, but nevertheless the whole administration was placed in the hands of elective bodies. This instantly led to very singular results. When the electoral assembly met in order to choose municipal officers, the curé and the seigneur were not to appear. They belonged, it was alleged, to the orders of the nobility and the clergy, and this was an occasion on which the commonalty had principally to choose its representatives. When, however, the multiple body was once elected, the curé and the seigneur were members of it by right, for it would not have been decent altogether to exclude two such considerable inhabitants from the government of the parish. The seigneur even presided over the parochial representatives, in whose election he had taken no part, but in most of their proceedings he had no voice. For instance, when the assessment and division of the taille were discussed, the curé and the seigneur were not allowed to vote, for were they not both exempt from this tax? On the other hand, the municipal council had nothing to do with their capitation tax, which continued to be regulated by the intendant according to peculiar forms. For fear that this president, isolated as he was from the body which he was supposed to direct, should still exert an indirect influence prejudicial to the interests of the order to which he did not belong, it was demanded that the votes of his own tenants should not count, and the provincial assemblies, being consulted on this point, gave it as their opinion that this omission was proper and entirely conformable to principle. Other persons of noble birth who might be inhabitants of the parish could not sit in the same plebeian corporation unless they were elected by the peasants, and then, as the bylaws carefully pointed out, they were only entitled to represent the lower classes. The seigneur, therefore, only figured in this assembly in a position of absolute subjection to his former vassals, who were all at once become his masters. He was their prisoner rather than their chief. In gathering men together by such means as these, it seemed as if the object was not so much to connect them more closely with each other as to render more palpable the differences of their condition and the incompatibility of their interests. Was or was not the village syndic still that discredited officer whose duties no one would accept but upon compulsion, or was the condition of the syndic raised with that of the community to which he belonged as its chief agent? Even this question was not easily answered. I found the letter of a village bailiff, written in 1788, in which he expresses his indignation at having been elected to the office of syndic, which was, he said, contrary to all the privileges of his other post. To this the Comptroller General replies that this individual must be set right, that he must be made to understand that he ought to be proud of the choice of his fellow citizens, and that, moreover, the new syndics were not to resemble the local officers who had formerly borne the same appellation, and that they would be treated with more consideration by the government. On the other hand, some of the chief inhabitants of parishes, and even men of rank, began at once to draw nearer to the peasantry as soon as the peasantry had become a power in the state. A landed proprietor, exercising a heritable jurisdiction over a village near Paris, complained that the king's edict debarred him from taking part, even as a mere inhabitant, in the proceedings of the parochial assembly. Others consented from mere public spirit, as they said, to accept even the office of syndic. It was too late, but as the members of the higher classes of society in France thus began to approach the rural population and sought to combine with the people drew back into the isolation to which it had been condemned and maintained that position. Some parochial assemblies refused to allow the seigneur of the place to take his seat among them. Others practiced every kind of trick to evade the reception of persons as low-born as themselves, but who were rich. We are informed, said the Provincial Assembly of Lower Normandy, that several municipal bodies have refused to receive among their members landowners not being noble and not domiciled in the parish, though these persons have an undoubted right to sit in such meetings. Some other bodies have even refused to admit farmers not having any property in land in the parish. Thus, then, the whole reform of these secondary enactments was already novel, obscure, and conflicting before the principal laws affecting the government of the state had yet been touched at all. But all that was still untouched was the already shaken, and it could barely be said that any law was in existence which had not already been threatened with abolition or a speedy change by the central government itself. This sudden and comprehensive renovation of all the laws and all the administrative habits of France, which preceded the political revolution of 1789, is a thing scarcely thought of at the present time, yet it was one of the severest perturbations which ever occurred in the history of a great people. This first revolution exercised a prodigious influence on the revolution which was about to succeed it, and caused the latter to be an event different from all the events of the same kind which had ever till then happened in the world, and from those which have happened since. The first English Revolution, which overthrew the whole political constitution of the country and abolished the monarchy itself, touched but superficially the secondary laws of the land and changed scarcely any of the customs and usages of the nation. The administration of justice and the conduct of public business retained their old forms and followed even their past aberrations. In the heat of the civil wars, the 12 judges of England are said to have continued to go the circuit twice a year. Everything was not therefore abandoned to agitation at the same time. The Revolution was circumscribed in its effects, and English society, though shaken at its apex, remained firm upon its base. France herself has since 1789 witnessed several revolutions which have fundamentally changed the whole structure of her government. Most of them have been very sudden and brought about by force in open violation of the existing laws. Yet the disorder they have caused has never been either long or general. Scarcely have they been felt by the bulk of the nation. Sometimes they have been unperceived. The reason is that since 1789 the administrative constitution of France has ever remained standing amidst the ruins of her political constitutions. The person of the sovereign or the form of the government was changed, but the daily course of affairs was neither interrupted nor disturbed. Every man still remained submissive in the small concerns which interested himself to the rules and usages with which he was already familiar. He was dependent on the secondary powers to which it had always been his custom to defer, and in most cases he had still to do with the very same agents. For if at each revolution the administration was decapitated, its trunk still remained unmutilated and alive. The same public duties were discharged by the same public officers who carried with them through all the vicissitudes of political legislation the same temper and the same practice. They judged and they administered in the name of the king, afterwards in the name of the republic, at last in the name of the emperor, and when fortune had again given the same turn to her wheel, they began once more to judge and to administer for the king, for the republic, and for the emperor, the same persons doing the same thing, for what is there in the name of a master. Their business was not so much to be good citizens as to be good administrators and good judicial officers. As soon as the first shock was over, it seemed therefore as if nothing had stirred in the country. But when the Revolution of 1789 broke out, that part of the government, which, though subordinate, makes itself daily felt by every member of the Commonwealth, and which affects his well-being more constantly and decisively than anything else, had just been totally subverted. The administrative offices of France had just changed all their agents and revised all their principles. The state had not at first appeared to receive a violent shock from this immense reform, but there was not a man in the country who had not felt it in his own particular sphere. Everyone had been shaken in his condition, disturbed in his habits, or put to inconvenience in his calling. A certain order still prevailed in the more important and general affairs of the nation, but already no one knew whom to obey, whom to apply to, nor how to proceed in those lesser and private affairs which form the staple of social life. The nation having lost its balance in all these details, one more blow sufficed to upset it altogether, and to produce the widest catastrophe and the most frightful confusion that the world had ever beheld. End of section 26. Section 27 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 20, showing that the Revolution proceeded naturally from the existing state of France. I propose, ere I conclude, to gather up some of the characteristics which I have already separately described, and to trace the revolution proceeding, as it were, of itself from the state of society in France, which I have already portrayed. If it be remembered that in France the feudal system, though it still kept unchanged all that could irritate or could injure, had most effectually lost all that could protect or could be of use, it will appear less surprising that the revolution, which was about virtually to abolish this ancient constitution of Europe, broke forth in France rather than elsewhere. If it be observed that the French nobility, after having lost its ancient political rights and ceased more than in any other country of feudal Europe to govern and guide the nation, had nevertheless not only preserved but considerably enlarged its pecuniary immunities and the advantages which the members of this body personally possessed, that whilst it had become a subordinate class, it still remained a privileged and close body, less and less an aristocracy, as I have said elsewhere, but more and more a caste. It would be no cause of surprise that the privileges of such nobility had become so inexplicable and so abhorrent to the French people as to inflame the envy of the democracy to so fierce a pitch that it is still burning in their hearts. If, lastly, it be borne in mind that the French nobility, severed from the middle classes whom they had repelled, and from the people whose affections they had lost, was thus alone in the midst of the nation, apparently the head of an army, but in reality a body of officers without soldiers, it would be understood how that which had stood erect for 1,000 years came to perish in a night. I have shown how the king's government, having abolished the franchises of the provinces, and having usurped all local powers in 3/4 of the territory of France, had thus drawn all public affairs into its own hands, the least as well as the greatest. I've shown, on the other hand, how by a necessary consequence Paris had made itself the master of the kingdom of which till then it had been the capital, or rather had itself become the entire country. These two facts, which were peculiar to France, would alone suffice, if necessary, to explain why a riot could fundamentally destroy a monarchy which had for ages endured so many violent convulsions, and which on the eve of its dissolution still seemed unassailable even to those who were about to overthrow it. France, being one of the states of Europe in which all political life had been for the longest time and most effectually extinguished, in which private persons had most lost the usage of business, the habit of reading the course of events, the experience of popular movements, and almost the notion of the people, it may readily be imagined how all Frenchmen came at once to fall into a frightful revolution without foreseeing it, those who were most threatened by that catastrophe leading the way and undertaking to open and widen the path which led to it. As there were no longer any free institutions, or consequently any political classes, no living political bodies, no organized or disciplined parties, and as in the absence of all these regular forces, the direction of public opinion, when public opinion came again into being, devolved exclusively on the French philosophers, it might be expected that the revolution would be directed less with a view to a particular state of facts than with reference to abstract principles and very general theories. It might be anticipated that, instead of endeavoring separately to amend the laws which were bad, all laws would be attacked, and that an attempt would be made to substitute for the ancient constitution of France an entirely novel system of government conceived by these writers. The Church being naturally connected with all the old institutions which were doomed to perish, it could not be doubted that the revolution would shake the religion of the country when it overthrew the civil government, wherefore it was impossible to foretell to what pitch of extravagance these innovators might rush, delivered at once from all the restraints which religion, custom, and law imposed on the imagination of mankind. He who should thus have studied the state of France would easily have foreseen that no stretch of audacity was too extreme to be attempted there, and no act of violence too great to be endured. What, said Burke in one of his eloquent pamphlets, is there not a man who can answer for the smallest district? Nay, more, not one man who can answer for another. Every one is arrested in his own home without resistance, whether he be accused of royalism, of moderantism, or of anything else. But Mr. Burke knew but little of the condition in which that monarchy which he regretted had abandoned France to her new masters. The administration which had preceded the Revolution had deprived the French both of the means and of the desire of mutual assistance. When the Revolution arrived, it would have been vain to seek in the greater part of France for any 10 men accustomed to act systematically and in concert, or to provide for their own defense. The central power had alone assumed that duty, so that when this central power had passed from the hands of the crown into those of an irresponsible and sovereign assembly, and had become as terrible as it had before been good-natured, nothing stood before it to stop or even to check it for a moment. The same cause which led the monarchy to fall so easily rendered everything possible after its fall had occurred. Never had toleration in religion, never had mildness in authority, never had humanity and goodwill to mankind been more professed, and it seemed more generally admitted than in the 18th century. Even the rights of war, which is the last refuge of violence, had become circumscribed and softened. Yet from this relaxed state of manners a revolution of unexampled inhumanity was about to spring, though this softening of the manners of France was not a mere pretense, for no sooner had the Revolution spent its fury than the same gentleness immediately pervaded all the laws of the country and penetrated into the habits of political society. The contrast between the benignity of its theories and the violence of its actions, which was one of the strangest characteristics of the French Revolution, will surprise no one who has remarked that this revolution had been prepared by the most civilized classes of the nation, and that it was accomplished by the most barbarous and the most rude. The members of those civilized classes, having no pre-existing bond of union, no habit of acting in concert, no hold upon the people almost instantly became supreme when the old authorities of the state were annihilated. Where the people did not actually assume the government, it gave its spirit to those who governed, and if, on the other hand, it be recollected what the manner of life of that people had been under the old monarchy, it may readily be surmised what it would soon become. Even the peculiarities of its condition had imparted to the French people several virtues of no common occurrence. Emancipated early and long, possessed of a part of the soil, isolated rather than dependent, the French showed themselves at once temperate and proud, sons of labor, indifferent to the delicacies of life, resigned to its greater evils, firm in danger, a simple and manly race who were about to fill those mighty armies before which Europe was to bow. But the same cause made them dangerous masters, as they had borne almost alone for centuries all the burden of public wrongs. As they had lived apart, feeding in silence on their prejudices, their jealousies, and their hatreds, they had become hardened by the rigor of their destiny, and capable both of enduring and of inflicting every evil. Such was the state of the French people when, laying hands on the government, it undertook to complete the work of the Revolution. Books had supplied the theory, the people undertook the practical application, and adapted the conceptions of those writers to the impulse of their own passions. Those who have attentively considered in these pages the state of France in the 18th century must have remembered the birth and development of two leading passions, which, however, were not contemporaneous, and which did not always tend to the same end. The first, more deeply seated and proceeding from a more remote source, was the violent and inextinguishable hatred of inequality. This passion, born and nurtured in presence of the inequality it abhorred, had long impelled the French with a continuous and irresistible force to raise to their foundations all that remained of the institutions of the Middle Ages, and upon the ground thus cleared to construct a society in which men should be as much alike and their conditions as equal as human nature admits of. The second, of a more recent date and a less tenacious root, led them to desire to live not only equal but free. At the period immediately preceding the Revolution of 1789, these two passions were equally sincere and appeared to be equally intense. At the outbreak of the Revolution they met and combined. For a moment they were intimately mingled. They inflamed each other by mutual contact and kindled at once the whole heart of France. Such was 1789, a time of inexperience, no doubt, but a time of generosity, of enthusiasm, of virility, and of greatness. A time of immortal memory, towards which the eyes of mankind will turn with admiration and respect long after those who witnessed it, and we ourselves shall have disappeared. Then indeed the French were sufficiently proud of their cause and of themselves to believe that they might be equal in freedom. Amidst their democratic institutions, they therefore everywhere placed free institutions. Not only did they crush to the dust all that effete legislation which divided men into castes, corporations, and classes, and which rendered their rights even more unequal than their conditions, but they shattered by a single blow those other laws more recently imposed by the authority of the Crown, which had deprived the French nation of the free enjoyment of its own powers, and had placed by the side of every Frenchman the government as his preceptor, his guardian, and, if need be, his oppressor. Centralization fell with absolute government. But when the vigorous generation which had commenced the Revolution was destroyed or enervated, as commonly happens to any generation which engages in such enterprises, when following the natural course of events of this nature, the love of freedom had been damped and discouraged by anarchy and popular tyranny, and the bewildered nation began to grope after a master, absolute government found prodigious facilities for recovering and consolidating its authority, and these were easily discovered by the genius of the man who was to continue the revolution and to destroy it. France, under the old monarchy, had in fact contained a whole system of institutions of modern date, which, not being adverse to social equality, could easily have found a place in the new state of society, but which offered remarkable opportunities to despotism. These were sought for amidst the ruins of all other institutions, and they were found there. These institutions had formerly given birth to habits, to passions, and to opinions which tended to retain men in a state of division and obedience. And such were the institutions which were restored and set to work. Centralization was disentangled from the ruins and reestablished, and as whilst this system rose once more, everything by which it had before been limited was destroyed. From the bowels of that nation which had just overthrown monarchy, a power suddenly came forth, more extended, more comprehensive, more absolute than that which had ever been exercised by any of the French kings. This enterprise appeared strangely audacious, and its success unparalleled, because men were thinking of what they saw, and had forgotten what they had seen. The Dominator fell, but all that was most substantial in his work remained standing. His government had perished, but the administration survived, and every time that an attempt has since been made to strike down absolute power, all that has been done is to place a head of liberty on a servile body. Several times from the commencement of the Revolution to the present day, the passion of liberty has been seen in France to expire, to revive, and then to expire again, again to revive. Thus will it long be with a passion so inexperienced and ill-directed, so easily discouraged, alarmed, and vanquished. A passion so superficial and so transient. During the whole of this period, the passion for equality has never ceased to occupy that deep-seated place in the hearts of the French people which it was the first to seize. It clings to the feelings they cherish most fondly, whilst the love of freedom frequently changes its aspect, wanes and waxes, grows or declines with the course of events. That other passion is still the same, ever attracted to the same object, with the same obstinate and indiscriminating ardor, ready to make any sacrifice to those who allow it to sate its desires, and ready to furnish every government which will favor and flatter it with the habits, the opinions, and the laws which despotism requires to enable it to reign. The French Revolution will ever be wrapped in clouds and darkness to those who direct their attention to itself alone. The only light that can illuminate its course must be sought in the times which preceded it. Without a clear perception of the former society of France, of its laws, of its defects, of its prejudices, of its littleness, of its greatness. It is impossible to comprehend what the French have been doing in the 60 years which have followed its dissolution, but even this perception will not suffice without penetrating to the very quick into the character of this nation. When I consider this people in itself, it strikes me as more extraordinary than any event in its own annals. Was there ever any nation on the face of the earth so full of contrasts and so extreme in all its actions, more swayed by sensations, less by principles, led therefore always to do either worse or better than was expected of it, sometimes below the common level of humanity, sometimes greatly above it? A people so unalterable in its leading instincts that its likeness may still be recognized in descriptions written 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, but at the same time so mutable in its daily thoughts and in its tastes as to become a spectacle and an amazement to itself, and to be as much surprised as the rest of the world at the sight of what it has done. A people beyond all others, the child of home and the slave of habit, when left to itself, though when once torn against its will from the native hearth, and from its daily pursuits, ready to go to the end of the world, and to dare all things. Indocile by temperament, yet accepting the arbitrary and even the violent rule of a sovereign more readily than the free and regular government of the chief citizen. Today the declared enemy of all obedience, tomorrow serving with a sort of passion which the nations best adapted for servitude cannot attain, guided by a thread as long as no one resists, ungovernable when the example of resistance has once been given, always deceiving its masters, who fear it either too little or too much, never so free that it is hopeless to enslave it, or so enslaved that it may not break the yoke again, apt for all things but excelling only in war, adoring chance, force, success, splendor, and noise, more than true glory, more capable of heroism than of virtue, of genius than of good sense, ready to conceive immense designs rather than to accomplish great undertakings, the most brilliant and the most dangerous of the nations of Europe, and that best fitted to become by turns an object of admiration, of hatred, of pity, of terror, but never of indifference. Such a nation could alone give birth to a revolution so sudden, so radical, so impetuous in its course, and yet so full of reactions, of contradictory incidents, and of contrary examples. Without the reasons I have related, the French would never have made the revolution, but it must be confessed that all these reasons united would not have sufficed to account for such a revolution anywhere else but in France. I am arrived, then, at the threshold of this great event. My intention is not to go beyond it now, though perhaps I may do so hereafter. I shall then proceed to consider it not only in its causes, but in itself, and I shall venture finally to pass a judgment on the state of society which it has produced. End of section 27. Section 28 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Supplementary Chapter on the Pays d'État, and especially on the constitutions of Languedoc. It is not my intention minutely to investigate in this place how public business was carried on in each of the provinces called Pays d'État, which were still in existence at the outbreak of the Revolution. I wish only to indicate the number of them, to point out those in which local life was still most active, to show what were the relations of these provinces with the administration of the Crown. How far they formed an exception to the general rules I have previously established, how far they fell within those rules, and lastly to show by the example of one of these provinces what they might all have easily become. Estates had existed in most of the provinces of France, that is, each of them had been administered under the king's government by the gens des trois états. as they were then called, which meant the representatives of the clergy, the nobility, and the commons. This provincial constitution, like most of the other political institutions of the Middle Ages, occurred with the same features in almost all the civilized parts of Europe, in all those parts at least into which Germanic manners and ideas had penetrated. In many of the provinces of Germany, these states subsisted down to the French Revolution. In those provinces in which they had been previously destroyed, they had only disappeared in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. Everywhere for 200 years the sovereigns had carried on a clandestine or an open warfare against them. Nowhere had they attempted to improve this institution with the progress of time, but only to destroy and deform it whenever an opportunity presented itself, and when they could not do worse. In France in 1789, these states only existed in 5 provinces of a certain extent and in some insignificant districts. Provincial liberty could, in truth, only be said to exist in 2 provinces, in Brittany and in Languedoc. Everywhere else the institution had entirely lost its virility and was reduced to a mere shadow. I shall take the case of Languedoc separately and devote to it in this place a closer examination. Languedoc was the most extensive and the most populous of all the pays d'État. It contained more than 2,000 parishes, or as they were then called, communities, and nearly 2 millions of inhabitants. It was, besides, the best ordered and the most prosperous of all these provinces, as well as the largest. Languedoc is therefore the fairest specimen of what provincial liberty might be under the old French monarchy, and to what an extent, even in the districts where it appeared strongest, it had been subjected to the power of the crown. In Languedoc the estates could only assemble upon the express order of the king, and under a writ of summons addressed by the king individually every year to the members of whom they were composed, which caused one of the malcontents of the time to say, "Of the 3 bodies composing our estates, one, that of the clergy, sits at the nomination of the king, since he names to the bishoprics and benefices, and the 2 others may be supposed to be so, since an order of the court may prevent any member it pleases from attending the assembly, and this without exiling or prosecuting him by merely not summoning him." The estates were not only to meet, but to be prorogued on certain days appointed by the king. The customary duration of their session had been fixed at 40 days by an order in council. The king was represented in the assembly by commissioners who had always free access when they required it, and whose business it was to explain the will of the government. The assembly was, moreover, strictly held in restraint. They could take no resolution of any importance. They could determine on no financial measure at all until their deliberations had been approved by an order in council. For a tax, a loan, or a suit at law, they require the express permission of the king. All their standing orders, down to that which related to the order of their meetings, had to be authorized before they became operative. The aggregate of their receipts and expenditure, their budgets, as it would now be called, was subjected every year to the same control. The central power, moreover, exercised in Languedoc the same political rights which were everywhere else acknowledged to belong to it. The laws which the crown was pleased to promulgate, the general ordinances it was continually passing, the general measures of its policy were applicable there as well as in the rest of the kingdom. The crown exercised there all the natural functions of government. It had there the same police and the same agents. There, as well as everywhere else, it created numerous new public officers, whose places the province was compelled to buy up at a large price. Languedoc was governed, like the other provinces of France, by an intendant. This intendant had in each district his sub-delegates who corresponded with the heads of the parishes and directed them. The intendant exercised the tutelage of the administration as completely as in the pays d'élection. The humblest village in the gorges of the Cevennes was precluded from making the smallest outlay until it had been authorized by an order of the King's Council from Paris. That part of the judicial administration which is now denominated in France the Canton tiers administratif, or the litigated questions referred to the Council of State, was not only not less but more comprehensive than in the remainder of France. The intendant decided in the first instance all questions relating to the public ways. He judged all suits relating to roads, and in general he pronounced on all the matters in which the government was or conceived itself to be interested. The government extended the same protection as elsewhere to all its agents against the rash prosecutions of the citizens whom they might have oppressed. What then did Languedoc possess which distinguished it from the other provinces of the kingdom, and which caused them to envy its institutions? Three things suffice to render it entirely different from the rest of France. 1. An assembly composed of men of station, looked up to by the population, respected by the crown, to which no officer of the central power, or, to use the phraseology then in use, no officer of the king, could belong, and in which every year the special interests of the province were freely and gravely discussed. The mere fact that the royal administration was placed near this source of light caused its privileges to be very differently exercised, and though its agents and its instincts were the same, its results in no degree resembled what they were elsewhere. 2. In Languedoc, many public works were executed at the expense of the king and his agents. There were other public works for which the central government provided the funds and partly directed the execution, but the greater part of them were executed at the expense of the province alone. When the king had approved the plan and authorized the estimates for these last-mentioned works, they were executed by officers chosen by the estates and under the inspection of commissioners taken from this assembly. 3. Lastly, the province had the right of levying itself, and in the manner it preferred, a part of the royal taxes and all the rates which were imposed by its own authority for its own wants. Let us see the results which Languedoc continued to extract from these privileges. They deserve a minute attention. Nothing is more striking in the other parts of France, the pays d'élection, than the almost complete absence of local charges. The general imposts were frequently oppressive, but a province spent nothing on itself. In Languedoc, on the contrary, the annual expenditure of the province on public works was enormous, and in 1780 it exceeded 2 millions of livres. The central government was sometimes alarmed at witnessing so vast an outlay. It feared that the province, exhausted by such an effort, would be unable to acquit the share of the taxes due to the state. It blamed the estates for not moderating this expenditure. I have read a document framed by the Assembly in answer to these animadversions. The passages I am about to transcribe from it will depict better than all I could say the spirit which animated this small government. It is admitted in this statement that the province has commenced and is still carrying on immense public works, but far from offering any apology for this proceeding, it is added that, saving the opposition of the crown, these works will be still further extended and persevered in. The province had already improved or rectified the channel of the principal rivers within its territory, and it was then engaged in adding to the canal of Burgundy, dug under Louis XIV, but already insufficient, a prolongation which, passing through lower Languedoc, should proceed by Cette and Agen to the Rhône. The port of Cette had been opened to trade and was maintained at great cost. All these expenses had, as was observed, a national rather than a provincial character, yet the province, as the party chiefly interested, had taken them on itself. It was also engaged in draining and restoring to agriculture the marshes of Anjou, Moor. Roads had been the object of its peculiar care. All those which connect the province with the rest of the kingdom had been opened or put in good order. Even the crossroads between the towns and villages of Languedoc had been repaired. All these different roads were excellent even in winter, and formed the greatest contrast with the hard, uneven, and ill-constructed roads which were to be found in most of the adjacent provinces, such as Dauphiny, Quercy, and the government of Bordeaux. Au pays d'élection, it was remarked. On this point the report appeals to the opinion of travelers and traders, and this appeal was just, for Arthur Young, when he visited the country 10 years afterwards, put on his notes, Languedoc pays d'état, good roads made without compulsory labor. If the king would allow it, this report continued, the states will do more. They will undertake the improvement of the crossroads in the villages, which are not less interesting than the others. For if produce cannot be removed from the barns of the grower to market, what use is it that it can be sent to a distance? The doctrine of the states on questions of public works has always been, they say, that it is not the grandeur of these undertakings, but their utility that must be looked to. Rivers, canals, roads, which give value to all the produce of the soil and of manufactures, by enabling them to be conveyed at all times and at little cost wherever they are wanted, and by means of which commerce can penetrate to every part of the province. These are things which enrich a country, whatever they may cost it. Besides, works of this nature, undertake in moderation at the same time in various parts of the country, and somewhat equally distributed, keep up the rate of wages, and stand in lieu of relief to the poor. The king has not needed to establish charitable workhouses at his cost in Languedoc, as has been done in other parts of France, said the province with honest pride. We do not ask for that favor. The useful works we ourselves carry on every year supersede such establishments, and give to all our people productive labor. The more I have studied the general regulations established by the states of Languedoc with the permission of the king, though generally not originating with the crown, in that portion of the public administration which was left in their hands, the more I have been struck with the wisdom, the equity, and the moderation they display. The more superior do the proceedings of the local government appear in comparison with all I have found in the districts administered by the king alone. The province was divided into communities, towns or villages, into administrative districts called dioceses, and lastly into 3 great departments called stewardries. Each of these parts had a distinct representation and a little separate government of its own, which acted under the guidance either of the estates or the crown. If it be a question of public works which interest one of these small political bodies, they are only to be undertaken at the request of the interested parties. If the improvements of a community are of advantage to the diocese contributed to the expense in a certain proportion. If the stewardry was interested, the stewardry contributed likewise. So again, these several divisions were all to assist the townships, even for the completion of undertakings of local interest, if they were necessary and above its strength. For, said the Straits frequently, the fundamental principle of our constitution is that all parts of Languedoc are reciprocally bound together, and ought successively to help each other. The works executed by the province were to be carefully prepared beforehand, and first submitted to the examination of the lesser bodies which were to contribute to them. They were all paid for. Forced labor was unknown. I've observed that in the other parts of France, the pays d'élection, the land taken from its owners for public works was always ill and tardily paid for, and often not paid for at all. This was one of the great grievances complained of by the provincial assemblies when they were convoked in 1787. In some cases the possibility of liquidating debts of this nature had been taken away, for the object taken had been altered or destroyed before the valuation. In Languedoc, every inch of ground taken from its owner was to be carefully valued before the works were begun, and paid for in the first year of the execution. The regulations of these estates relating to different public works, from which these details are copied, seem so well conceived that even the central government admired, though without imitating them. The King's Council, after having sanctioned the application of them, caused them to be printed at the royal press, and to be transmitted to all the intendants of France as a document to be consulted. What I have said of public works is a fortiori applicable to that other, not less important portion of the provincial administration which related to the levy of taxes. In this respect, more particularly, the contrast was so great between the kingdom and the provinces that it is difficult to believe they formed part of the same empire. I've had occasion to say elsewhere that the methods of proceeding used in Languedoc for the assessment and collection of the taille were in part the same as are now employed in France in the levy of the public taxes. Nor shall I here revert to this subject, merely adding that the province was so attached to its own superior methods of proceeding that when new taxes were imposed by the crown, the states of Languedoc never hesitated to purchase at a very high price the right of levying them in their own manner and by their own agents exclusively. In spite of all the expenses which I've successively enumerated, the finances of Languedoc were nevertheless in such good order, and its credit so well established, that the central government often had recourse to it, and borrowed in the name of the province sums of money which would not have been lent on such favourable terms to the government itself. Thus Languedoc borrowed on its own security, but for the king's service in the later years of the monarchy, 73,200,000 livres, or nearly 3 millions sterling. The government and the ministers of the crown looked, however, with an unfavourable eye on these provincial liberties. Richelieu had first mutilated and afterwards abolished them. The spiritless and indolent Louis XIII, who loved nothing, detested them. The horror he felt for all provincial privileges was such, said Boulainvilliers, that his anger was excited by the mere name of them. It is hard to sound the hatred of feeble souls for whatever compels them to exert themselves. All that they retain of manhood is turned in that direction, and they exhibit strength in their animosity, however weak they may be in everything else. Fortunately, the ancient constitution of Languedoc was restored under the minority of Louis XIV, who consequently respected it as his own work. Louis XV suspended it for a couple of years, but afterwards allowed it to go on. The creation of municipal offices for sale exposed the constitution of the province to dangers less direct, but not less formidable. That pernicious institution not only destroyed the constitution of the towns, it tended to vitiate that of the provinces. I know not whether the deputies of the commons in the provincial assemblies had ever been elected ad hoc, but at any rate they had long ceased to be so. The municipal officers of the towns were ex officio the sole representatives of the burgesses and the people in those bodies. This absence of a direct constituency, acting with reference to the affairs of the day, was but little remarked as long as the towns freely elected their own magistrates by universal suffrage, and generally for a very limited period. Thus the mayor, the council, or the syndic represented the wishes of the population in the hall of the estates as faithfully as if they had been elected by their fellow citizens for that purpose. But very different was the case with a civic officer who had purchased for money the right of governing. Such an officer represented no one but himself, or at best the petty interest or the petty passions of his own coterie. Yet this magistrate, by contrast, retained the powers which had been exercised by his elected predecessors. The character of the institution was therefore immediately changed. The nobles and the clergy, instead of having the representatives of the people sitting with them or opposite to them in the provincial assembly, met there none but a few isolated, timid, and powerless burgesses, and thus the commons occupied a more subordinate place in the government at the very time when they were every day becoming richer and stronger in society. This was not the case in Languedoc, the province having always taken care to buy up these offices as fast as they were established by the crown. The loan contracted by the states for this purpose in the year 1773 only amounted to more than 4 million of livres. Other causes of still greater power had contributed to infuse a new spirit into these ancient institutions, and to give to the states of Languedoc an incontestable superiority over those of all the other provinces. In this province, as in a great portion of the south of France, the taille was real and not personal. That is to say, it was regulated by the value of property and not by the personal condition of the proprietor. Some lands had no doubt the privilege of not paying this tax. These lands had in former times belonged to the nobility, but by the progress of time and of capital it had happened that a portion of this property had fallen into the hands of non-noble holders. On the other hand, the nobles had become the holders of many lands which were liable to the taille. The privilege of exemption being thus removed from persons to things was doubtless more abused. But it was less felt because, though still irksome, it was no longer humiliating, not being indissolubly connected with the idea of a class, not investing any class with interests altogether alien and opposed to those of the other classes. Such a privilege no longer opposed a barrier to the cooperation of all in public affairs. In Languedoc, especially, more than in any other part of France, all classes did so cooperate, and this on a footing of complete equality. In Brittany, the landed gentry of the province had the right of all appearing in their own persons at the states, which made these assemblies in some sort resemble the Polish diets. In Languedoc the nobles only figured at the states of the province by their representatives. 23 of them sat for the whole body. The clergy also sat in the person of the 23 bishops of the province, and it deserves especial observation that the towns had as many votes as the two upper orders. As the assembly sat in one house, and the orders did not vote separately but conjointly, the commons naturally acquired much importance, and their spirit gradually infused itself into the whole body. Nay, more, the 3 magistrates who, under the name of syndics general, were charged in the name of the states with the ordinary management of the business, were almost always lawyers, that is to say, commoners. The nobility was strong enough to maintain its rank, but no longer strong enough to reign alone. The clergy, though consisting to a great extent of men of gentle birth, lived on excellent terms with the commons. They eagerly adopted most of the plans of that order, and labored in conjunction with it to increase the material prosperity of the whole community by encouraging trade and manufactures, thus placing their own great knowledge of mankind and their singular dexterity in the conduct of affairs at the service of the people. A priest was almost always chosen to proceed to Versailles to discuss with the ministers of the crown the questions which sometimes set at variance the royal authority and that of the states. It might be said that throughout the last century Languedoc was administered by the commons, who were controlled by the nobles and assisted by the bishops. Thanks to this peculiar constitution of Languedoc, the spirit of the age was enabled peacefully to pervade this ancient institution and to modify it altogether without at all destroying it. It might have been so everywhere else in France. A small portion of the perseverance and the exertions which the sovereigns of France employed for the abolition or the dislocation of the provincial estates would have sufficed to perfect them in this manner, and to adapt them to all the wants of modern civilization, if those sovereigns had ever had any other aim than to become and to remain the masters of France. End of section 28. Section 29 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3. The chapters which follow were not included in the work first published by Monsieur de Tocqueville in 1855. They are the continuation of it, left unfinished at the time of his death in 1859, and published in 1865 by Monsieur de Beaumont amongst the posthumous works of his friend. They are now translated for the first time, although they must be regarded as incomplete, since they never received the final revision of the author, and the latter portions of them are fragmentary. Yet they are not, I think, unworthy to form part of the work to which they were intended to belong, and a melancholy interest attaches to them as the last meditations of a great and original thinker. In the French text an attempt has been made to distinguish by a different type the passages which are more carefully finished from those which consisted merely of notes for further elaboration. But as this arrangement breaks the uniformity of the text more than is necessary, I have not adopted it. H.R. Chapter 1. Of the violent and undefined agitation of the human mind at the moment when the French Revolution broke out. What I have previously said of France is applicable to the whole continent. In the 10 or 15 years preceding the French Revolution, the human mind was abandoned throughout Europe to strange, incoherent, and irregular impulses, symptoms of a new and extraordinary disease, which would have singularly alarmed the world if the world had understood them. A conception of the greatness of man in general, and of the omnipotence of his reason and the boundless range of his intelligence, had penetrated and pervaded the spirit of the age. Yet this lofty conception of mankind in general was commingled with a boundless contempt for the age in which men were living and the society to which they belonged. Never was so much humility united to so much pride. The pride of humanity was inflated to madness. The estimate each man formed of his age and country was singularly low. All over the continent that instinctive attachment and involuntary respect which the men of all ages and all countries are wont in general to feel for their own peculiar institutions, for their traditional customs, and for the wisdom or the virtues of their forefathers, had almost ceased to exist among the educated classes. Nothing was spoken of but the decrepitude and incoherence of existing institutions, the vices and corruption of existing society. Traces of this state of mind may be discovered throughout the literature of Germany. The philosophy, the history, the poetry, even the novels of the time are full of it. Every product of the intellect was so stamped by it that the books of that epoch bear a mark that distinguishes them from the works of every other age. All the memoirs of that day, which gave birth to a profusion of memoirs, all the correspondence of the time which has been published, attest a state of mind so different from the present that nothing short of this concurrence of certain and abundant evidence could convince us of the fact. Every page of Schlosser's History of the 18th Century reveals this general presentiment that a great change was about to take place in the condition of mankind. George Forster, one of the companions of Captain Cook, to whose expedition he had been attached with his father as a naturalist, writes to Jacobi in 1779, "Things cannot remain as they are. This is announced by every symptom in the world of science, in the world of theology, and in that of politics. Much as my heart has hitherto desired peace, not less do I desire to see the arrival of this crisis on which such mighty hopes are founded. Europe," he writes again in 1782, "seems to me on the brink of a horrible revolution. In truth, the mass is so corrupt that bleeding may well be necessary. The present state of society," said Jacobi, "presents to me nothing but the aspect of a dead and stagnant sea. That is why I could desire an inundation, be it what it may, even of barbarians, to sweep away this reeking marsh and lay bare a fresh soil. We are living in the midst of shattered institutions and forms, a monstrous chaos which everywhere reflects an image of dismay and of death. These things were written in a pretty country house by wealthy people, surrounded by their literary friends, who passed their time in endless philosophical discussions, which affected, excited, and inflamed them till they shed torrents of daily tears in imagination. It was not the princes, the ministers, the rulers, or those, in short, who in different capacities were directing the march of affairs, who perceived that some great change was at hand. The idea that government could become quite different from what government then was, that all which had lasted so long might be destroyed and superseded by that which as yet only existed in the brain of a few men of letters. The thought that the existing order of things might be overthrown to establish a new order in the midst of disorder and ruin would have appeared to them an absurd illusion and a fantastic dream. The gradual improvement of society seemed to them the limit of the possible. It is a common error of the people who are called wise and practical in ordinary times to judge by certain rules the men whose very object is to change or to destroy those rules. When a time is come at which passion takes the guidance of affairs, the beliefs of men of experience are less worthy of consideration than the schemes which engage the imagination of dreamers. It is curious to see in the official correspondence of that epoch civil officers of ability and foresight laying their plans, framing their measures, and calculating scientifically the use they will make of their powers at a time when the government they are serving, the laws they are applying, the society they are living in, and they themselves shall be no more. What scenes are passing in France, writes Johann Müller on the 6th of August, 1789. Blessed be the impression they produce on the nations and on their masters. I know there are excesses, but the cost of a free constitution is not too great, is not a storm which purifies the air better than an atmosphere tainted as with the plague, even though here and there it should strike a few heads. What an event! Exclaimed Fox. How much the greatest it is that ever happened in the world, and how much the best. Can we be surprised that this conception of the Revolution as a general uprising of humanity, a conception which enlarged and invigorated so many small and feeble souls, should have taken possession at once of the mind of France, when even other countries partook of it? Nor is it astonishing that the first excesses of the Revolution should have affected the best patriots of France so little, when even foreigners who were not excited by the struggle or embittered by personal grievances could extend so much indulgence to them. Let it not be supposed that this sort of abhorrence of themselves and of their age, which had thus strangely fallen upon almost all the inhabitants of the continent of Europe, was a superficial or transient sentiment. 10 years later, when the French Revolution had inflicted on Germany all sorts of violent transformations, accompanied by death and destruction, even then one of those Germans in whom enthusiasm for France had turned to bitter hatred exclaims, mindful of the past, in a confidential effusion, "What was is no more. What new edifice will be raised on the ruins, I know not. But this I know, that it would be the direst calamity if this tremendous era were again to give birth to the apathy and the worn-out forms of the past." Yes, replied the person to whom these words were addressed, the old social body must perish. The years which preceded the French Revolution were, in almost every part of Europe, years of great national prosperity. The useful arts were everywhere more cultivated. The taste for enjoyments which follow in the train of affluence was more diffused. Industry and commerce which supply these wants were improving and spreading. It seemed as if the life of man becoming thus more busy and more sensual, the human mind would lose sight of those abstract studies which embrace society and would center more and more on the petty cares of daily life. But the contrary took place throughout Europe almost as much as in France. All the educated classes were plunged in philosophical discussions and dogmatical theories. Even in places ordinarily the most remote from speculations of this nature, the same train of argument was eagerly pursued. In the most trading cities of Germany, in Hamburg, Lübeck, and Danzig, the merchants, traders, and manufacturers would meet after the labors of the day to discuss amongst themselves the great questions which affect the existence, the condition, the happiness of man. Even the women, amidst their petty household cares, were sometimes distracted by these enigmas of life. We thought, says Perthes, that by becoming highly enlightened one might become perfect. Der König sei der beste Mann, sonst sei der bessere König, said the poet Claudius. This period, too, gave birth to a new passion embodied in a new word, cosmopolitism, which was to swallow up patriotism. It seemed as if all classes were bent on escaping whenever they could from the care of their private affairs to give themselves up to the grand interests of humanity. As in France, the love of letters filled a large space even in the busiest times. The publication of a new book was an event of interest in the smallest towns as well as in the chief cities. Everything was a subject of inquiry, everything was a source of emotion, treasures of passion seemed accumulated in every breast, which sought but an occasion to break forth. Thus a traveller who had been round the globe was an object of general attention. When Forster went to Germany in 1774, he was received with enthusiasm. Not a town but gave him an ovation. Crowds flocked about him to hear his adventures from his own lips, but still more to hear him describe the unknown countries he had visited and the strange customs of the men among whom he had been living. Was not their savage simplicity worthy more than all our riches and our arts? Were not their instincts above our virtues? A certain unfrocked Lutheran priest, one Basedow, ignorant, quarrelsome, and a drunkard, a caricature of Luther, excogitated a new system of schools which was, he said, to change the ideas and manners of his countrymen. He put forth his scheme in coarse and intemperate language. The object, as he took care to announce, was not only to regenerate Germany, but the human race. Forthwith all Germany is in movement. Princes, nobles, commons, towns, cities abet the great innovator. Lords and ladies of high estate write to Basedow to ask his advice. Mothers of families place his books in the hands of their children. The old schools founded by Melanchthon are forsaken. A college designed to educate these reformers of mankind is founded under the name of the Philanthropian. Blazes for a moment and disappears. The enthusiasm drops, leaving behind it confusion and doubt. The real spirit of the age was to reject every form of mysticism and to cling in all things to the evidence most palpable to the understanding. Nevertheless, in this violent perturbation of mind, men, not knowing as yet which way to look, cast themselves suddenly on the supernatural. On the eve of the French Revolution, Europe was covered with strange fraternities and secret societies, which only revived under new names delusions that had long been forgotten. Such were the doctrines of Swedenborg, of the Martinists, of the Freemasons, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians, the disciples of strict abstinence, the Mesmerists, and many other varieties of similar sects. Many of these sects originally contemplated no more than the private advantage of their members, but all of them now aspired to embrace the destinies of mankind. Most of them had been, at the time of their birth, wholly philosophical or religious. All now turned at once to politics and were absorbed in them. By different means they all proposed to bring about the regeneration of society and the reform of governments. It is especially worthy of remark that this sense of unrest, this perturbation of the human mind which I am describing, did not manifest itself in the lower classes, which bore nevertheless the burden of existing abuses. Those classes were still motionless and inert. Not the poor man, but the rich man was tossing in this feverish condition. The movement sunk not lower than the upper rank of the middle classes. Nowadays secret societies are filled by poor workmen, obscure artisans, or ignorant peasants. At the time I am speaking of, they consisted entirely of princes, great nobles, capitalists, merchants, and men of letters. When, in 1786, the secret papers of the Illuminati were seized in the hands of their principal chiefs, many anarchical documents were found among them in which personal property was denounced as the source of all evil, and absolute equality of conditions was vaunted. In the archives of the same sect a list of adepts was found. It consisted entirely of the most distinguished names in Germany, princes, great nobles, and ministers. The founder of the sect was himself a professor of canon law. The King of Poland and Prince Frederick of Prussia were Rosicrucians. The new King of Prussia, who had just succeeded Frederick the Great on the throne, immediately sent for the leading Rosicrucians and entrusted to them important missions. It is asserted, says Monnier, in his books on these sects, that several great personages of France and Germany, some of whom were Protestants, took the tonsure in order to be admitted into the sect of strict observance. Another thing well worthy of notice, it was a time when the sciences had discredited the marvelous as they became more positive and more certain, when the inexplicable was easily taken for the false, and when in all things reason claimed to supersede authority, reality the imaginary, and free inquiry faith. Nevertheless, there was not one of these sects I have just mentioned but had some point of contact with the supernatural. All of them ended in some fantastic conclusion. Some of them were imbued with mystical conceptions. Others fancied they had found out the secret to change some of the laws of nature. At that moment, every species of enthusiasm might pass for science. Every dreamer could find listeners. Every impostor could find believers. Nothing is more characteristic of the perplexed and agitated condition of men's minds, running to and fro like a benighted traveller who has lost his way, and who, instead of getting onward, doubles back upon his own footsteps. And it was not the common herd of the people who were at the head of these extravagances. Men of letters, men of learning, believed in alchemy, in the visible action of the demon, in the transmutation of metals, in the apparition of ghosts, strange instance of belief in every form of absurdity, growing amidst the decay of religious convictions, of men putting faith in every invisible and supernatural influence except in that of God. These mountebanks were the especial delight of sovereigns. Forster writes to his father from Cassel in 1782, an old French adventuress is here who shows spirits to the Landgrave and receives 150 louis d'or. He is vain enough to think that the devil may take the trouble to tempt him in person. She has with her another Frenchman who casts out bad spirits from the afflicted, etc., etc. Great monarchs had at their courts charlatans of the first water. Cagliostro, the Count de Saint-Germain, or Mesmer, the little princes were fain to put up, for want of better, with ridiculous little tricksters. The aspect of this society was nevertheless one of the most imposing which has ever been presented to the world, in spite of the errors and follies of the age. Never had humanity been prouder of itself than at that moment, for at no other moment, from the birth of all the ages, had man believed in his own omnipotence. The whole of Europe resembled a camp, awakening at break of day, bustling at first in different directions until the rising sun points out the destined track and illuminates the road of march. Alas, how little do those who come at the close of a great revolution resemble those who begin it. Full of lofty hopes, of generous designs, of stores of energy they are ready to pour forth, of noble disillusions, of unselfish disinterestedness. Many contemporary writers, unable to discern the general causes which had produced the strange subversion of society they were witnessing, attributed to a conspiracy of secret societies. As if any private conspiracy could ever explain a movement of such depth and so destructive of human institutions. The secret societies were certainly not the cause of the revolution, but they must be considered as one of the most conspicuous signs of its approach. They were not the only signs. It would be a mistake to suppose that the American Revolution was hailed with ardent sympathy in France alone. The noise of it went forth to the ends of Europe. Everywhere it was regarded as a beacon. Stephens, who 50 years later took so active a part in rousing Germany against France, relates in his memoirs that in early childhood the first thing that excited him was the cause of American independence. I still remember vividly, says he, what happened at Elsinore and in the roadstead on the day when that peace was signed which secured the triumph of freedom. The day was fine. The roadstead was full of people of all nations. We awaited with eager impatience the very dawn. All the ships were dressed, the masts ornamented with pennons, everything covered with flags. The weather was calm, with just wind enough to cause the gay bunting to flutter in the breeze. The boom of cannon, the cheers of the crews on deck, completed the festal character of the day. My father had invited some friends to his table. They drank to the victory of the Americans and the triumph of the popular cause, whilst a dim presentiment that great events would result from this triumph mingled with their rejoicings. It was the bright and cheering dawn of a bloody day. My father sought to imbue us with the love of political freedom, contrary to the habit of the house. He had us brought to table, where he impressed on us the importance of the event we were witnessing, and bade us drink with him and his guests to the welfare of the new Commonwealth. Of the men who, in every corner of old Europe, felt themselves thus moved by the deed of a small community in the New World, not one thoroughly understood the deep and secret cause of his own emotion, yet all heard a signal in that distant sound. What it announced was still unknown. It was the voice of John crying in the wilderness that new times were at hand. Seek not to assign to these facts which I have been relating any peculiar cause. All of them were different symptoms of the same social disease. On all hands, the old institutions and the old powers no longer fitted accurately the new condition and the new wants of man. Hence that strange unrest which led even the great and the worldly to regard their own state of life as intolerable. Hence that universal thirst for change which came unbidden to every mind, though no one knew as yet how that change could be brought about. An internal and spontaneous impulse seemed to shake at once the whole fabric of society and disturb to their foundations the ideas and habits of every man. To hold back was felt to be impossible, yet none knew on which side they would incline, and the whole of Europe was in the condition of a huge mass which oscillates before it falls. End of section 29. Section 30 of The State of Society in France Before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 2. How this vague perturbation of the human mind suddenly became, in France, a positive passion, and what form this passion at first assumed. In the year 1787, this vague perturbation of the human mind, which I have just described, and which had for some time past been agitating the whole of Europe without any precise direction, suddenly became, in France, an active passion directed to a positive object. But strange to say, this object was not that which the French Revolution was to attain, and the men who were first and most keenly affected by this new passion were precisely those whom the Revolution was to devour. At first, indeed, it was not so much the equality of rights as political freedom which was looked for, and the Frenchmen who were first moved themselves and who set society in motion belonged not to the lower but to the highest order. Before it sunk down to the people, this new-born detestation of absolute and arbitrary power burst forth amongst the nobles, the clergy, the magistracy, the most privileged of the middle classes. Those, in short, who, coming nearest in the state to the master, had more than others the means of resisting him and the hope of sharing his power. But why was the hatred of despotism the first symptom? Was it not because, in this state of general dissatisfaction, the common ground on which it was most easy to agree was that of war against a political power, which either oppressed everyone alike or supported that by which everyone was oppressed, and because the noble and the rich found in liberty the only mode of expressing this dissatisfaction which they felt more than any other class. I shall not relate how Louis XVI was led by financial considerations to convoke about him in an assembly the members of the nobility, the clergy, and the upper rank of the commons, and to submit to this body of notables the state of affairs. I am discussing history, not narrating it. It is well known that this assembly, which met at Versailles on the 22nd February 1787 consisted of 9 peers of France, 20 noblemen, 8 privy councillors, 4 masters of requests, 10 marshals of France, 13 archbishops or bishops, 18 chief judges, 22 municipal officers of different cities, 12 deputies of the provinces which had retained their local estates, and some other magistrates. In all, from 125 to 130 members. Henry IV had once before used the same means to postpone the meeting of the States General and to obtain without them a sort of public sanction to his measures, but the times were changed. In 1596 France was at the close of a long revolution, wearied by her efforts and distrustful of her powers, seeking nothing but rest, and asking of her rulers no more than an external deference. The notables caused her without difficulty to forget the States General, but in 1787 they only revived the recollection of them in her memory. In the reign of Henry IV, these princes, these nobles, these bishops, these wealthy commoners, who were summoned to advise the king, were still the masters of society. They could therefore control the movement they had set on foot. Under Louis XVI in 1787, these same classes retained only the externals of power. We have seen that the substance of it was lost to them forever. They were, so to speak, hollow bodies, resonant but easily crushed, still capable of exciting the people, incapable of directing it. This great change had come about insensibly and imperceptibly. By none was it clearly perceived. Those most affected by it knew not that it had taken place. Even their opponents doubted it. The whole nation had lived so long apart from its own concerns that it took but a hazy view of its condition. All the evils from which it suffered seemed to have merged into a spirit of opposition and a dislike for the existing government. No sooner were the notables assembled than, forgetting that they were the nominees of the sovereign, chosen by him to give their advice and not their injunctions, they proceeded to act as the representatives of the country. They demanded the public accounts, they censured the acts of the government, they attacked most of the measures, the execution of which they were merely asked to facilitate. Their assistance was sought, they proffered their opposition. Public opinion instantly rose in their favor and threw its whole weight on their side. Then was witnessed the strange spectacle of a government proposing measures favorable to the people without ceasing to be unpopular, and of an assembly resisting these measures with the support of public favor. Thus the government proposed to reform the salt tax, la gabelle, which pressed so heavily and often so cruelly on the people. It would have abolished forced labor, reformed the taille, and suppressed the 20ths, a species of tax from which the upper classes had continued to make themselves exempt. In place of these taxes, which were to be abolished or reformed, a land tax was to be imposed on the very same basis which has since become the basis of the land tax of France, and the custom houses which placed grievous restrictions on trade and industry were to be removed to the frontier of the kingdom. Beside, and almost in the place of, the intendants who administered each province, an elective body was to be constituted with the power not only of watching the conduct of public business, but in most cases of directing it. All these measures were conformable to the spirit of the times. They were resisted or postponed by the notables. Nevertheless, the government remained unpopular, and the notables had the public cry in their favor. Fearing that he had not been understood, the minister, Calonne, explained in a public document that the effect of the new laws would be to relieve the people from a portion of the taxes and to throw that portion on the rich. That was true, but the minister was still unpopular. The clergy, said he elsewhere, are, before all things, citizens and subjects. They must pay taxes like all the rest. If the clergy have debts, a part of their property must be sold to discharge them. That again was to aim at one of the tenderest points of public opinion. The point was touched, but the public were unmoved. On the question of the reform of the taille, the notables opposed it on the ground that it could not relieve those who paid it without imposing an excessive burden on the other taxpayers, especially on the nobility and clergy, whose privileges on the score of taxation had already been reduced to almost nothing. The abolition of internal custom houses was objected to peremptorily on behalf of the privileges of certain provinces, which were to be treated with great forbearance. They highly approved in principle the creation of provincial assemblies, but they desired that, instead of uniting together the three orders in these small local bodies, they should be separated and always be presided over by a nobleman or a prelate, for, said some of the committees of notables, these assemblies would tend to democracy if they were not guided by the superior lights of the first order. Nevertheless, the popularity of the notables remained unshaken to the end, nay, it was continually on the increase. They were applauded, incited, encouraged, and when they resisted the government, they were loudly cheered on to the attack. The king, hastening to dismiss them, thought himself obliged to offer them his public thanks. Not a few of these persons are said to have been amazed at this degree of public favor and sudden power. They would have been far more astonished at it if they could have foreseen what was about to follow, if they had known that these same laws which they had resisted with so much popular applause were founded on the very principles which were to triumph in the Revolution, that the traditional institutions which they opposed to the innovations of the government were precisely the institutions which the Revolution was about to destroy. That which caused the popularity of these notables was not the form of their opposition, but the opposition itself. They criticized the abuses of the government, they condemned its prodigality, they demanded an account of its expenditure, they spoke of the constitutional laws of the country, of the fundamental principles which limit the unlimited power of the crown, and without precisely demanding the interposition of the nation in the government by the States General, they perpetually suggested that idea. This was enough. The government had already long been suffering from a malady which is the endemic and incurable disease of powers that have undertaken to order, to foresee, to do everything. It had assumed a universal responsibility. However men might differ in the grounds of their complaints, they agreed in blaming the common source of them. What had hitherto been no more than a general inclination of mind then became a universal and impetuous passion. All the secret sores caused by daily contact with dilapidated institutions, which chafed both manners and opinion in 1,000 places, all the smothered animosities kept alive by divided classes, by contested positions, by absurd or oppressive distinctions, rose against the supreme power. Long had they sought a pathway to the light of day. That path once opened, they rushed blindly along it. It was not their natural path, but it was the first they found open. Hatred or arbitrary power became then their sole passion, and the government their common enemy. End of section 30. Section 31 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 3. How the Parliaments of France, following precedent, overthrew the monarchy. The feudal government whose ruins still shelter the nation had been a government in which arbitrary power, violence, and great freedom were commingled. Under its laws, if actions had often been restricted, speech was habitually independent and bold. The legislative power was exercised by kings, but never without control. When the great political assemblies of France ceased to be, the parliaments took in some sort the place of them. And before they enregistered in the code that regulated their judicial proceedings a new law decreed by the king, they stated to the sovereign their objections and made known to him their opinions. Much inquiry has been made as to the first origin of this usurpation of legislative power by judicial authority. It is vain to seek that origin elsewhere than in the general manners of the time, which could not tolerate or even conceive a power so absolute and secret as not at least to admit of discussion on the terms of obedience. The institution was in no wise premeditated. It sprang spontaneously from the very root of the ideas then prevalent and from the usages alike of subjects and of kings. An edict, before it was put in force, was sent down to the Parliament. The agents of the Crown explained its principles and its merits. The magistrates discussed it. All this was done in public, in open debate, with that virility which characterized all the institutions of the Middle Ages. It frequently happened that the Parliament sent deputies to the king several times over to supplicate him to modify or withdraw an edict. If the king came down in person, he allowed his own law to be debated with vivacity, sometimes with violence, in his presence. But when at last his will was made known, all was silence and obedience, for the magistracy acknowledged that they were no more than the first officers and representatives of the sovereign. Their duty was to advise, but not to coerce him. In 1787, the ancient precedents of the monarchy were faithfully and strictly followed. The old machine of royal government was again set in motion, but it became apparent that the machine was propelled by some new motive power of an unknown kind, which, instead of causing it to move onwards, was about to break it in pieces. The king then, according to custom, caused the new edicts to be brought down to the Parliament, and the Parliament, equally according to custom, laid its humble remonstrance at the steps of the throne. The king replied, and parliaments insisted. For centuries things had gone on thus, and the nation heard from time to time this sort of political dialogue carried on above its head between the sovereign and his magistrates. The practice had only been interrupted during the reign of Louis XIV, and for a time, but the novelty lay in the subject of the debate and the nature of the arguments. This time the Parliament, before it proceeded to register the edicts, called for all the accounts of the finance department, which we should now call the budget of the state, in support of the measures. And as the king naturally declined to hand over the entire government to a body which was irresponsible and non-elected, and so to share the legislative power with a court of justice, the Parliament then declared that the nation alone had the right to raise fresh taxes, and thereupon demanded that the nation should be convoked. The Parliament grasped the very heart of the people, but held it only for a moment. The arguments put forward by the magistracy in support of their demands were not less novel than the demands themselves. The king, they said, was only the administrator and not the owner of the public fortune, the representative and chief officer of the nation, not its master. Sovereignty resided in the nation itself. The nation alone could decide great questions. Its rights were not dependent on the will of the sovereign. They took their being from the nature of man. They were as inalienable and indestructible as human nature itself. The institution of the States General, they declared, is a principle founded on the rights of man and confirmed by reason. Common interest has combined men in society and given rise to governments. That alone can maintain them. No prescription of the States General can run against the nature of things or against the imperishable rights of the nation. Public opinion is rarely mistaken. It is rare that men receive impressions contrary to truth. The king, having exiled the Parliament from Paris, that body protested that liberty of speech and action was an inalienable right of man and could not be wrested from him without tyranny, save by the regular forms of judicial procedure. It must not be supposed that the parliaments alleged these principles as novelties. They were, on the contrary, very industriously traced up to the cradle of the monarchy. The judgments or decrees of the Parliament of Paris were crammed with historical quotations, frequently borrowed from the Middle Ages in barbarous Latin. They are full of provincial capitulations, royal ordinances, beds of justice, rules, privileges, and precedents, which lost themselves in the shadows of the past. Strangely enough, at the same moment that the Parliament of Franche-Comté proclaimed the indestructible rights of the nation, it protested against any infraction of the peculiar privileges of the province as they existed at the period of annexation under Louis XIV. So again the Parliament of Normandy invoked the States General of the kingdom to inaugurate a new order of things, but not the less did it demand, in the name of its own feudal traditions, the restoration of the States of Normandy as the peculiar privilege of that province. So curiously were ideas just born into the world enclosed and swathed in these remains of antiquity. It was a tradition of the old monarchy that the Parliament should use in its remonstrances animated and almost violent language. A certain exaggeration of words was conceded to it. The most absolute sovereigns had tolerated this license of speech by reason, indeed, of the powerlessness of those who uttered it. As they were certain in the end to be reduced to obedience and compressed within narrow limits, the indulgence of a free utterance was readily left to them. The Parliament, moreover, was wont to make a great deal of noise for a small result. What it said went beyond what it meant. This franchise had become a sort of right of the magistracy. On this occasion the Parliament carried their ancient freedom to a degree of license never heard before, for a new-born fire was burning in their hearts and unconsciously inflamed their language. Certainly among the governments of our own time, which are almost all nevertheless governments maintained by the sword, not one could allow its ministers and its measures to be attacked in such terms by the representatives of its own authority. Despotism, sire, said the Parliament of Paris, is substituted for the laws of the realm, and the magistracy is no more than the instrument of arbitrary power. Would that your majesty could interrogate the victims of that power, confined, forgotten, in impenetrable prisons, the abode of silence and injustice, those whom intrigue, cupidity, the jealousy of power, the thirst of vengeance, the fear or the hatred of justice, private pique or personal convenience have caused to be put there. Then, drawing a parallel between two citizens, one rich and the other poor, the latter being oppressed by the former, the Parliament added, "Is indigence then a crime? Have flesh and blood no claims? Does a man without credit or a poor man cease to be a citizen?" It was especially on the subject of taxation and against the collectors of the revenue that even in the calmest times the judicial bodies were accustomed to inveigh with extreme violence. No sooner was the new tax announced than the Parliament of Paris declared it to be disastrous. Consternation followed the proposal. Its adoption would give rise to a general mourning. The population, harassed by fiscal exactions, were at their wits' end. To arrogate to one's self the power of levying tribute without the States General was to declare aloud that the sovereign seeks not to be a king of France, but the king of serfs. The substance of the people was become the prey of the cupidity of courtiers and the rapacity of contractors. Great as was the excitement of that time, it would still be very difficult to account for the language of these magistrates without recalling what had been said so many times before on the same subject. As under the old monarchy, most of the taxes were levied on account of private persons who held them on farm or by their agents. For centuries past men had accustomed themselves to look upon taxation as it bore on the private emolument of certain individuals and not as the common income of the nation. Taxes were commonly denounced as odious exactions. The salt duty was styled the infernal machine of the gabelle. Those who collected the taxes were spoken of as public robbers, enriched by the poverty of everybody else. So said the taxpayers. The courts of justice held the same language, and even the government, which had leased to these very farmers the rights they exercised, scarcely spoke differently of them. It seemed as if their business was not its own, and that it sought a way of escape amidst the clamour which pursued its own agents. When, therefore, the Parliament of Paris spoke in this manner on the subject of taxes, it merely followed an old and general practice. The play was the same, but the audience was changed, and the clamour, instead of dying away, as it had commonly done within the limit of the classes whom their privileges caused to be but little affected by taxation, was now so loud and so reiterated that it penetrated to those classes which bore the heaviest burden, and ere long filled them with indignation. If the Parliament employed new arguments to vindicate its own rights, the government employed arguments not less new in defense of its ancient prerogatives. For example, in a pamphlet attributed to the court, which appeared about that time, the following passage occurs: "It is a question of privilege which excites the Parliament. They want to retain their exemption from taxation. This is nothing but a formidable combination between the nobility of sword and gown to continue under color of liberty to humble and enslave the commons, whom the king alone defends and means to raise." "My object has been," said Calonne, "to slay the hydra of privileges, exemptions, and abuses." Whilst, however, these discussions were going on upon the principle of government, the daily work of administration threatened to stop. There was no money. The Parliament had rejected the measures relating to taxation. It refused to sanction a loan. In this perplexity, the king, seeing that he could not gain over the Assembly, attempted to coerce it. He went down to the chamber, and before he proceeded to command their submission, less eager to exercise his rights than to confirm them, he caused the edicts to be again debated in his presence. He began by laying down that his authority was absolute. The legislative power resided in its integrity in his hands. He required no extraordinary powers to carry on the government. The States General, when he chose to consult them, could only tender advice. He was still the supreme arbiter of their representations and their grievances. This sitting took place on November 19th, 1787. Having said thus much, everyone was allowed to speak in his presence. The most opposite and often violent propositions were asserted to his face during a discussion of 8 hours, after which he withdrew, declaring as his last word that he refused to convoke the States General at present, though he promised them for the year 1791. Yet after having thus suffered his most acknowledged and least formidable rights to be contested in his own presence, the king resolved to resume the exercise of those which were most disputed and most unpopular. His own act had opened the mouths of the speakers, but he sought to punish them for having spoken. In one of its remonstrances, the Parliament of Paris had said, "Sire, the French monarchy would be reduced to a state of despotism if, under the king's authority, ministers could dispose of personal freedom by lettre de cachet, and of the rights of property by lit de justice, of civil and criminal affairs by scire facias, and of the judicature itself by partial exile or by the arbitrary translation of judges." To which the king replied, "If the greater number of votes in my courts can constrain my will, the monarchy would become a mere aristocracy of magistrates." "Sire," rejoined the Parliament, "no aristocracy in France, but no despotism." Two men in the course of this struggle had especially distinguished themselves by the boldness of their speeches and by their revolutionary attitude. These men were M. Goualard and M. de Prémenil. It was resolved to arrest them. Then occurred a scene, the prelude, so to speak, of the great tragedy that was to follow, well calculated to exhibit an easy-going government under the aspect of tyranny. Informed of the resolution taken against them, these two magistrates left their homes and took refuge in the Parliament itself, in the full dress of their order, where they were lost amidst the crowd of judges forming that great body. The Palace of Justice was surrounded by troops and the doors guarded. Viscount d'Anjou, who commanded them, appeared alone in the great chamber. The whole Parliament was assembled and sitting in the most solemn form. The number of the judges, the venerable antiquity of the court, the dignity of their dress, the simplicity of their demeanor, the extent of their power, the majesty of their very hall, filled with all the memorials of our history, all contributed to make the Parliament the greatest and most honored thing in France after the throne. In presence of such an assembly, the officer stood at first at gaze. He was asked who sent him there. He answered in rough but embarrassed accents, and demanded that the two members whom he was ordered to arrest should be pointed out to him. The Parliament sat motionless and silent. The officer withdrew, re-entered, then withdrew again, the Parliament still motionless and silent, neither resisting nor yielding. The time of year was that when the days are shortest. Night came on. The troops lit fires round the approaches to the palace, as round a besieged fort. The populace, astonished by so unwonted a sight, surrounded them in crowds, but stood aloof. The populace was touched, but not yet excited, and therefore stood aloof to contemplate, by the light of those bivouac fires, a scene so new and unwonted under the monarchy. For there it might see how the oldest government in Europe applied itself to teach the people to outrage the majesty of the oldest institutions, and to violate in their sanctuary the most august of ancient powers. This lasted till midnight, when de Prémenil at last rose. He thanked the Parliament for the effort it had made to save him. He declined to trespass longer on the generous sympathy of his colleagues. He commended the Commonwealth and his children to their care, and descending the steps of the court, surrendered himself to the officer. It seemed as if he was leaving that assembly to mount the scaffold. The scaffold, indeed, he was one day to mount, but that was in other times and under other powers. The only living witness of this strange scene, Duke Pasquier, has told me that at these words of de Prémenil, the whole assembly burst into tears, as if it had been Regulus marching out of Rome to return to the horrid death which awaited him in Carthage. The Marshal de Noailles sobbed aloud. Alas, how many tears were ere long to be shed on loftier woes than these! Such grief was no doubt exaggerated, but not unreal. At the commencement of a revolution, the vivacity of emotion greatly exceeds the importance of events, as at the close of revolution it falls short of them. Having thus struck a blow at the whole body of the parliaments, represented by their chief, it only remained to annihilate their power. 6 edicts were simultaneously published. These edicts, which roused all France, were designed to effect several of the most important and useful reforms which the Revolution has since accomplished: the separation of the legislative and judicial powers, the abolition of exceptional courts of justice, and the establishment of all the principles which to this day govern the judicial organization of France, both civil and criminal. All these reforms were conceived in the true spirit of the age, and met the real and lasting wants of society, but as they were aimed at the privileged jurisdiction of the parliaments, they struck down the idol of the hour, and they emanated from a power which was detested. That was enough. In the eyes of the nation, these new edicts were a triumph of absolute government. The time had not yet come when everything may be pardoned by democracy to despotism in exchange for order and equality. In a moment the nation rose. Each parliament became at once a focus of resistance, round which the orders of the province grouped themselves so as to present a firm front to the action of the central power of government. France was at that time divided, as is well known, into 13 judicial provinces, each of which was attached to a parliament. All these parliaments were absolutely independent of one another. All of them had equal prerogatives. All of them were invested with the same right of discussing the mandates of the legislator before submitting to them. This organization will be seen to have been natural on looking back to the time when most of these courts of justice were founded. The different parts of France were so dissimilar in their interests, their disposition, their customs, and their manners, that the same legislation could not be applied to all of them at once. As a distinct law was usually enacted for each province, it was natural that in each province there should be a parliament whose duty it was to test this law. In more recent times, the French having become more similar, one law sufficed for all, but the right of testing the law remained divided. An edict of the king, applying equally to the whole of France, after it had been accepted and executed in a certain manner in one part of the territory, might still be modified or contested in the 12 other parts. That was the right, but that was not the custom. For a long period of time, the separate parliaments had ceased to contest anything save the administrative rules which might be peculiar to their own province. They did not debate the general laws of the kingdom, unless the peculiar interests of their own province seemed to be affected by some one of their provisions. As for the principle of such laws, their opportunity or efficiency, these were considerations they did not commonly entertain. On these points they were wont to rely on the Parliament of Paris, which by a sort of tacit agreement was looked up to by all the other parliaments as their political guide. On this occasion each Parliament chose to examine these edicts as if they concerned its own province alone, and as if it had been the sole representative of France. Each province chose to distinguish itself by a separate resistance in the midst of the general resistance they encountered. All of these discuss the principle of each edict, as well as its special application. A clause which had been accepted without difficulty by one of these bodies was obstinately opposed elsewhere. One of them barely notices what called forth the indignation of another. Assailed by 13 adversaries at once, each of which attacked with different weapons and struck in different places, the government, amidst all these bodies, could not lay its hand upon a single head. But what was even more remarkable than the diversity of these attacks was the uniform intention which animated them. Each of the 13 courts struggled after its own fashion and upon its own soil, but the sentiment which excited them was identically the same. The remonstrances made at that time by the different parliaments and published by them would fill many volumes, but open the book where you will, you seem to be reading the same page, always the same thoughts expressed for the most part in the same words. All of them demanded the States General in the name of the imprescriptible rights of the nation. All of them approved of the conduct of the Parliament of Paris, protested against the acts of violence directed against it, encouraged it to resist, and imitated, as well as it could, not only its measures, but the philosophical language of its opposition. Subjects, said the Parliament of Grenoble, have rights as well as the sovereign, rights which are essential to all who are not slaves. The just man, said the Parliament of Normandy, does not change his principles when he changes his abode. The king, said the Parliament of Besançon, cannot wish to have for his subjects humiliated slaves. A tumult raised at the same time by all these magistrates scattered over the surface of the country sounds like the confused noise of a multitude. Listen attentively to what they are saying. It is as the voice of one man. What is it, then, that the country was saying thus simultaneously? Everywhere you find the same ideas and the same expressions, so that beneath the unity of the judicature you discover the unity of the nation. And through this multiplicity of old institutions, of local customs, of provincial privileges, of different usages, which seem to sever France into so many different peoples, each living a separate life, you discern one of the nations of the earth in which the greatest degree of similarity subsists between man and man. This movement of the parliaments, at once multiple and uniform, attacking like a crowd, striking like a single arm, this judicial insurrection was more dangerous to the government than all other insurrections, even military revolt, because it turned against the government that regular civil and moral power, which is the habitual instrument of authority. The strength of an army may coerce for a day, but the constant defense of governments lies in courts of justice. Another striking point in this resistance of the judicial bodies was not so much the mischief they themselves did to the government as that which they allowed to be done to it by others. They established, for instance, the worst form of liberty of the press, that namely which springs not from a right but from the non-execution of the laws. They introduced, too, the right of holding promiscuous meetings, so that the different members of each order and the orders themselves could remove for a time the barrier which divided them and concert a common course of action. Thus it was that all the orders in each province engaged gradually in the struggle, but not all at the same time or in the same manner. The nobility were the first and boldest champions in that contest against the absolute powers of the king. It was in the place of the aristocracy that absolute government had taken root. They were the first to be humbled and annoyed by some obscure agent of the central power, who, under the name of an intendant, was sent perpetually to regulate and transact behind their backs the smallest local affairs. They had produced not a few of the writers who had protested with the greatest energy against despotism, free institution, and the new opinions, had almost everywhere found in the nobles their chief supporters. Independently of their own grievances, they were carried away by the common passion, which had become universal, as is demonstrated by the nature of their attacks. Their complaint was not that their peculiar privileges had been violated, but that the common law of the realm had been trampled underfoot. The provincial estates abolished, the States General interrupted, the nation treated like a minor, and the country deprived of the management of its own affairs. At this first period of the Revolution, when hostilities had not yet broken out amongst the ranks of society, the language of the aristocracy was exactly the same as that of the other classes, distinguished only by going greater lengths and taking a higher tone. Their opposition had something republican about it. It was the same feeling animating prouder men and souls more accustomed to live in contact with the world's greatness. A man who had till then been a violent enemy of the privileged orders, having been present at one of the meetings where the opposition was organized and where the nobles had made a sacrifice of all their rights amidst the applause of the commons, relates this scene in a letter to a friend, and exclaims with enthusiasm, "Our nobility, our truly a nobility, has come down to point out our rights, to defend them with us. I've heard it with my own ears. Free elections, equality of numbers, equality of taxation. Every heart was touched by their disinterestedness and kindled by their patriotism. When public rejoicings took place at Grenoble upon the news of the dismissal of the Archbishop of Sens, August 29, 1788, the city was instantly illuminated and covered with transparencies, on one of which the following lines were read: Noble, vous mérites, et le sort qui vous décore de l'État chancelant, vous êtes les soutiens. La nation par vous va briser ses liens. Déjà de plus beaux jours on voit briller l'or. In Brittany, the nobles were ready to arm the peasants in order to resist the royal authorities, and at Paris, when the first riot broke out August 24, 1788, which was feebly and indecisively repressed by the army, several of the officers who belonged, as is well known, to the nobility resigned their commissions rather than shed the blood of the people. The Parliament complimented them on their conduct and called them those noble and generous soldiers whom the purity and delicacy of their sentiments had compelled to resign their commissions. The opposition of the clergy was not less decided. Though more discreet, it naturally assumed the forms appropriate to the clerical body. When the Parliament of Paris was exiled to Troyes, and received the homage of all the public bodies of that city, the chapter of the cathedral, as the organ of the clergy, complimented the Parliament in the following terms: The vigor restored to the constitutional maxims of the monarchy has succeeded in defeating the territorial subsidy, and you have taught the Treasury to respect the sacred rights of property. The general mourning of the nation, and your own removal from your duties and from the bosom of your families, were to us a poignant spectacle, and whilst these august walls echoed the sounds of public grief, we carried into the sanctuary our private sorrow and our prayers. Official Papers, 1787. Wherever the three orders combined in opposition, the clergy made their appearance. Usually the bishop spoke little, but he took the chair which was offered him. The famous meeting at Romans, that which protested with the greatest violence against the edicts of May, was alternately presided over by the Archbishop of Narbonne and the Archbishop of Vienne. Generally speaking, parish priests were seen at all the meetings of the orders, where they took a lively and direct part in the debates. At the outset of the struggle, the middle classes had shown themselves timid and irresolute, yet it was on those classes especially that the government had relied for consolation in its distress and for aid without abandoning its ancient prerogatives. The propositions of the government had been framed with peculiar regard to the interests of the middle classes and to their passions. Long habituated to obedience, they did not engage without apprehension in a course of resistance. Their opposition was tempered with caution. They still flattered the power to which they were opposed and acknowledged its rights while they contested the use of them. They seemed partly seduced by its favors and ready to yield to the government, provided some share of government were bestowed on themselves. Even when they appeared to direct, the middle classes never ventured to walk alone. Impelled by an internal heat which they did not care to show, they sought rather to turn the passions of the upper classes to their own advantage than to increase the violence of them. But as the struggle was prolonged, the bourgeoisie became more excited, more animated, more bold, until it outstripped the other classes, assumed the leading part, and kept it until the people appeared upon the stage. At this period of the contest, not a trace is to be seen of a war of classes. All the orders of the Parliament of Toulouse breathe nothing but concord, and their only ambition is to promote the common happiness. A man then unknown, but who afterwards became celebrated for his talents and for his misfortunes, Bonnard, in a paper written in defense of the tiers-état, pointed out this agreement of the three orders, and exclaimed, with the enthusiasm of the time, "Ministers of religion, you obtained from the reverence of our forefathers the right to form among yourselves the first order of the state. You are an integral part of the French Constitution, and you ought to maintain it. And you, illustrious families, the monarchy has never ceased to flourish under your protection. You created it at the cost of your blood. You have many times saved it from the foreigner. Save it now from internal enemies. Secure to your children the splendid benefits your fathers have handed down to you. The name of hero is not honored under a servile sky." These sentiments might be sincere. One sole passion, paramount to the other passions, pervaded all classes, namely, a spirit of resistance to the government as the common enemy, a spirit of opposition throughout, in small as well as in great affairs, which struck at everything and assumed all shapes, even those which disfigured it. Some, in order to resist the government, laid stress on what remained of old local franchises. Here a man stood up for some old privilege of his class, some secular right of his calling or his corporation. There another man, forgetting his grievances and animosity against the privileged classes, denounced an edict which, he said, would reduce to nothing the seigneurial jurisdictions, and would thus strip the nobles of all the dignity of their fiefs. In this violent struggle every man grasped, as if by chance, the weapon nearest at hand, even when it was the least suited to him. If one took note of all the privileges, all the exclusive rights, all the old municipal and provincial franchises which were at this epoch claimed, asserted, and loudly demanded, the picture would be at once very exact and very deceptive. It would appear as if the object of the impending revolution was not to destroy but restore the old order of society. So difficult is it for the individuals who are carried along by one of the great movements of human society to distinguish the true motive power amongst the causes by which they are themselves impelled. Who would have imagined that the impulse which caused so many traditional rights to be asserted was the very passion which was leading irresistibly to their entire abolition? Now let us close our ears for a moment to these tumultuous sounds proceeding from the middle and upper classes of the nation, to catch, if we may, some whisper beginning to make itself heard from the midst of the people. No sign that I can discover from this distance of time announced that the rural population was at all agitated. The peasant plodded onwards in his wonted track. That vast section of the nation was still neutral and, as it were, unseen. Even in the towns the people remained a stranger to the excitement of the upper classes, and indifferent to the stir which was going on above its head. They listened, they watched, with some surprise, but with more curiosity than anger. But no sooner did the agitation make itself felt among them than it was found to have assumed a new character. When the magistrates re-entered Paris in triumph, the people, which had done nothing to defend these members of Parliament, arrested in their places, gathered together tumultuously to hail their return. I've said in another part of this book that nothing was more frequent under the old regime than riots. The government was so strong that it willingly allowed these transient ebullitions to have free scope, but on this occasion there were numerous indications that a very different state of things had begun. It was a time when everything old assumed new features. Riots, like everything else, corn riots, have perpetually occurred in France, but they were made by mobs without order, object, or consistence. Now, on the contrary, broke out the insurrection, as we have since so often witnessed it, with its tocsin, its nocturnal cries, its sanguinary placards, a fierce and cruel apparition, a mob infuriated, yet organized and directed to some end, which rushes at once into civil war and shatters every obstacle. Upon the intelligence that the Parliament had prevailed, and that the Archbishop of Sens retired from the ministry, the populace of Paris broke out in disorderly manifestations, burnt the minister in effigy, and insulted the watch. These disturbances were, as usual, put down by force, but the mob ran to arms, burnt the guard-houses, disarmed the troops, attempted to set fire to the Hôtel Lamoignon, and was only driven back by the king's household troops. Such was the early but terrible germ of the insurrections of the Revolution. The reign of terror was already visible in disguise. Paris, which nowadays 100,000 men scarcely keep in order, was then protected by an indifferent sort of police called the Watch. Paris had in it neither barracks nor troops. The household troops and the Swiss guards were quartered in the environs. This time the Watch was powerless. In presence of so general and so novel an opposition, the government showed signs at first of surprise and of annoyance rather than of defeat. It employed all its old weapons, proclamations, lettres de cachet, exile, but it employed them in vain. Force was resorted to enough to irritate, not enough to terrify. Moreover, a whole people cannot be terrified. An attempt was made to excite the passions of the multitude against the rich, the citizens against the aristocracy, the lower magistrates against the courts of justice. It was the old game, but this too was played in vain. New judges were appointed, but most of them new magistrates refused to sit. Favors, money were proffered. Venality itself had given way to passion. An effort was made to divert the public attention, but it remained concentrated. Unable to stop or even to check the liberty of writing, the government sought to use it by opposing one press to another press. A number of little pamphlets were published on its side at no small cost. Nobody read the defense, but the myriad pamphlets that attacked it were devoured. All these pamphlets were evolved from the abstract principles of Rousseau's Contrat Social. The sovereign was to be a citizen king. Every infraction of the law was treason against the nation. Nothing in the whole fabric of society was sound. The court was a hateful den in which famished courtiers devoured the spoils of the people. At length an incident occurred which hurried on the crisis. The Parliament of Dauphiny had resisted like all the other parliaments and had been smitten like them all. But nowhere did the cause which it defended find a more general sympathy or more resolute champions. Mutual class grievances were there, perhaps more intense than in any other place, but the prevailing excitement lulled for a time all private passions, and whereas in most of the other provinces each class carried on its warfare against the government separately and without combination, in Dauphiny they regularly constituted themselves into a political body and prepared for resistance. Dauphiny had enjoyed for ages its own states, which had been suspended in 1618 but not abolished. A few nobles, a few priests, a few citizens, having met of their own accord in Grenoble, dared to call upon the nobility, the clergy, and the commons to meet as provincial estates in a country house near Grenoble named Vézille. This building was an old feudal castle, formerly the residence of the Dukes of Les de Genières, but recently purchased by a new family, that of Perrier, to whom it belongs to this day. No sooner had they met in this place than the three orders constituted themselves, and an air of regularity was thrown over their irregular proceedings. 49 members of the clergy were present, 233 members of the nobility, 391 of the commons. The members of the whole meeting were counted. Not to divide the orders, it was decided, but without discussion, that the president should be chosen from one of the two higher orders, and the secretary from the commons. The Count de Monge was called to the chair. Monsieur Monnier was named secretary. The assembly then proceeded to deliberate and protested in a body against the edicts of May and the suppression of the Parliament. They demanded the restoration of the old estates of the province which had been arbitrarily and illegally suspended. They demanded that in these estates a double number of representatives should be given to the commons. They called for the prompt convocation of the States General, and decided that on the spot a letter should be addressed to the king, stating their grievances and their demands. This letter, couched in violent language and in a tone of civil war, was in fact immediately signed by all the members. Similar protests had already been made, and similar demands had been expressed with equal violence, but nowhere as yet had there been so signal an example of the union of all classes, the members of the nobility and the clergy. says the Journal of the House, were complimented by a member of the Commons on the loyalty with which, laying aside former pretensions, they had hastened to do justice to the Commons, and on their zeal to support the union of the three orders. The President replied that the peers would always be ready to act with their fellow citizens for the salvation of the country. The Assembly of Vézelay produced an amazing effect throughout France. It was the last time that an event, happening elsewhere than in Paris, has exercised a great influence on the general destinies of the country. The government feared that what Dauphiny had dared to do might be imitated elsewhere. Despairing at last of conquering the resistance opposed to it, it declared itself beaten. Louis XVI dismissed his ministers, abolished or suspended his edicts, recalled the parliaments, and granted the States General. This was not, it must be well remarked, a concession made by the king on a point of detail. It was a renunciation of absolute power. It was a participation in the government that he admitted and secured to the country by at length conceding in earnest the States General. One is astonished in reading the writings of that time to find them speaking of a great revolution already accomplished before 1789. It was in truth a great revolution, but one destined to be swallowed up and lost in the immensity of the revolution about to follow. Numerous, indeed, and prodigious in extent were the faults that had to be committed to bring affairs to the state they then were in, but the government of Louis XVI, having allowed itself to be driven to such a point, cannot be condemned for giving way. No means of resistance were at its disposal. Material force it could not use, as the army lent a reluctant and nerveless support to its policy. The law it could not use, for the courts of justice were in opposition. In the old kingdom of France, moreover, the absolute power of the crown had never had a force of its own, nor possessed instruments depending solely on itself. It never assumed the aspect of military tyranny. It was not born in camps and never had recourse to arms. It was essentially a civil power, a work not of violence but of art. This government was so organized and as easily to overpower individual resistance, but its constitution, its precedents, its habits, and those of the nation forbade it to govern against a majority in opposition. The power of the crown had only been established by dividing classes, by hedging them round with the prejudices, the jealousies, the hatreds peculiar to each of them, so as never to have to do with more than one class at once, and to bring the weight of all the others to bear against it. No sooner had these different classes, sinking for a moment by barriers by which they had been divided, met and agreed upon a common resistance, though but for a single day, than the absolute power of the government was conquered. The Assembly of Vézelay was the outward and visible sign of this new union and of what it might bring to pass. And although this occurrence took place in the depths of a small province and in a corner of the Alps, it thus became the principal event of the time. It exhibited to every eye that which had been as yet visible but to few, and in a moment it decided the victory. End of section 31. Section 32 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 4. The parliaments discover that they have lost all authority just when they thought themselves masters of the kingdom. When the royal authority had been conquered, the parliaments at first conceived that the triumph was their own. They returned to the bench, less as reprieved delinquents than as conquerors, and thought that they had only to enjoy the sweets of victory. The king, when he withdrew the edicts which had raised to the bench new judges, ordered that at least the judgments and decrees of those judges should be maintained. The parliaments declared that whatever had been adjudged without themselves was not adjudged at all. They summoned before them the insolent magistrates who had presumed to aspire to their seats, and borrowing an old expression of medieval law to meet this novel incident, they noted them infamous. All France saw that the king's friends were punished for their fidelity to the crown, and learnt that henceforth safety was not to be found on the side of obedience. The intoxication of these magistrates may easily be understood. Louis XIV, in all his glory, had never been the object of more universal adulation, if that word can be applied to immoderate praise prompted by genuine and disinterested passions. The Parliament of Paris, exiled to Troyes, was received in that city by all the public bodies, which hastened to pay it the homage due to the sovereign, and to utter to its face the most extravagant compliments. August senators, they said, generous citizens, strict and compassionate magistrates, you all deserve in every French heart the title of fathers of your country. You are the consolation of the nation's ills. Your actions are sublime examples of energy and patriotism. The French nation looks upon you with tenderness and veneration. The chapter of the Cathedral of Troyes, complimenting them in the name of the Church, said, "Our country and our religion solicit some durable monument of what you have done." Even the university came forth in gowns and square caps to draw out its homage in bad Latin. Illustrissimi senatus princeps praesides insulae senatores interregnimi. We share the general emotion, and we are here to express our lively admiration of your patriotic heroism. Hitherto the highest courage was that military valor which calls legions of heroes from their homes. We now see the heroes of peace in the sanctuary of justice, like those generous citizens who were the pride of Rome in their day of triumph. You have earned a triumph which secures to you immortal fame. The first president replied to all these addresses curtly, like a sovereign, and assured the speakers of the goodwill of his court. In several provinces, the arrest or exile of the judges had provoked riots. In all, their return gave rise to almost insane explosions of popular rejoicing. At Grenoble, when the courier arrived, who brought the news of the restoration of the parliaments, he was carried in triumph through the town and overpowered with caresses and acclamations. Women, unable to reach his person, kissed his horse. In the evening the whole town was spontaneously illuminated. All the public bodies and guilds defiled before the Parliament, declaiming bombastic compliments. At Bordeaux, on the same day, there was a similar ovation. The people took the horses from the carriage of the first president and drew him to his chambers. The judges who had obeyed the king's orders were hooted. The first president reprimanded them in public. In the midst of this scene, the oldest member of the Parliament exclaimed, "My children, tell this to your descendants, that the remembrance of this day may keep alive the fire of patriotism." He who said this was an aged man, born 90 years before, whose youth had been spent under the reign of Louis XIV. What changes may not take place in the opinions and the language of a people within the lifetime of a man? They ended by burning a cardinal in effigy on the market-place, which did not prevent the clergy from singing a Te Deum. These events took place at the end of October 1788. Suddenly the acclamations which surrounded the parliaments ceased. The enthusiasm dropped. Silence and solitude gathered about them. Not only were they the objects of public indifference, but all sorts of charges were brought against them, the same which the government had vainly attempted to urge. The country was inundated with vituperative pamphlets against them. These judges, it was said in these pamphlets, know nothing of politics. In reality they have only been aiming at power. They are at one with the nobles and the priests, and as hostile as these are to the commons, who constitute almost the entire nation. They fancied that their attack on despotism would cause all this to be forgotten, but in asserting the rights of the nation, they have allowed them to be questioned. Those rights are derived from the social contract. To discuss them is to clothe them in the false colors of voluntary concession. Indeed, the demands they made from the king were in some respects excessive. They are an aristocracy of lawyers who want to be masters of the king himself. Another pamphlet attributed to Volney apostrophized them in these terms: "August body of magistrates, we are under sacred obligations to you which we do not disown, but we cannot forget that during all these years that you have represented the people, you have allowed it to be oppressed. You, the teachers of the people, have allowed almost all the books calculated to enlighten it to be burnt, and when you resisted despotism, it was because it was about to crush yourselves. Especially for the Parliament of Paris was the fall sudden and terrible. How shall I describe the mighty void, the death-like silence which encompassed that great court, and its own sense of impotence and despair, or the scornful vengeance of the crown, when in reply to fresh remonstrances, Louis XVI said, I have no answer to make to my Parliament or to its supplications. With the assembled nation, I am about to concert measures to consolidate for ever public order and the prosperity of the kingdom. The same measure which recalled the Parliament to its hall of justice restored de Prémania to liberty. The reader will remember the dramatic scene of his arrest, his address in the style of Regulus, the emotion of the audience, and the immense popularity of the martyr. He was confined in the Île Sainte-Marguerite off Cannes. The warrant for his discharge arrives, and he starts. On the road he is at first treated as a great man, but as he proceeds the radiance that surrounded him fades away. Once at Paris, nobody cares about him, unless it be to cut a joke. To descend thus from the sublime to the ridiculous, he had only to post across the territory some 200 leagues. The Parliament, wretched at the discovery of its unpopularity, endeavored to regain the favor of the public. Recourse was had to stirring means. The same language which had so often served to excite the people in its favor was again employed. The cry for periodical sessions of the States General, for the responsibility of ministers, for personal freedom, for the liberty of the press, all was in vain. The amazement of the judges was extreme. They were totally unable to comprehend what was happening before their eyes. They continued to speak of the Constitution to be defended, not seeing that this word was popular enough when the Constitution was opposed to the king, but hateful to public opinion when it was opposed to equality. They condemned a publication which attacked the old institutions of the kingdom to be burnt by the common hangman, not perceiving that the ruin of these institutions was precisely what was desired. They asked of one another what could possibly have brought about such a change in the public mind. They fancied that they had a strength of their own, not being aware that they had only been the blind auxiliaries of another power. Everything as long as that power made them its instruments, nothing as soon as, being able to act on its own behalf, it ceased to need their assistance. They did not see that the same wave which had driven them along and raised them so high carried them back with it as it retired. Originally the Parliament consisted of jurists and advocates chosen by the king from the ablest members of their profession. A path to honors and to the highest offices of state was thus opened by merit to men born in the humblest conditions of fortune. The Parliament was then, with the Church, one of those powerful democratic institutions which were born and had implanted themselves on the aristocratic soil of the Middle Ages. At a later period the Crown, to make money, put up to sale the right of administering justice. The Parliament was then filled by a certain number of wealthy families who considered the national judicature as a privilege of their own, to be guarded from the intrusion of others with increasing jealousy. They obeyed in this the strange impulse which seemed to impel each particular body to dwindle more and more into a small, close aristocracy at the very time when the opinions and general habits of the nation caused society to incline more and more to democracy. Nothing certainly could be more opposed to the ideas of the time than a judicial caste, exercising by purchase the whole jurisdiction of the country. No practice, indeed, had been more often and more bitterly censured for a century past than the sale of these offices. This magistracy, vicious as it was in principle, had nevertheless a merit which the better constituted tribunals of our own time do not always possess. The judges were independent. They administered justice in the name of the sovereign, but not in compliance with his will. They obeyed no passions but their own. When all the intermediate powers which might counterbalance or attenuate the unlimited power of the king had been struck down, the Parliament alone still remained firm. The Parliament could still speak when all the world was silent, and maintain itself erect for a time when all the world had long been forced to bow. The consequence was that it became popular as soon as the government was out of favor with the nation, and when for a moment hatred of despotism had become a fervent passion and a sentiment common to all Frenchmen, the parliaments appeared to be the sole remaining barrier against absolute power. The defects which had been most blamed in them acted as a sort of guarantee of their political honesty. Even their vices were a protection, and their love of power, their presumption, and their prejudices were arms which the nation used. But no sooner had absolute power been definitely conquered, and the nation felt assured that it could defend its own rights, than the Parliament again at once became what it was before, an old, decrepit, and discredited institution, a legacy of the Middle Ages, again exposed to the full tide of public aversion. To effect its destruction, the king had only to endure its triumph. End of section 32. Section 33 of The State of Society in France Before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 5. Absolute power being subdued, the true spirit of the revolution forthwith became manifest. The bond of a common passion had for an instant linked all classes together. No sooner was that bond relaxed than they flew asunder, and the veritable spirit of the revolution, disguised before, was suddenly unveiled. After the triumph which had been obtained over the king, the next thing was to ascertain who should win the fruits of the victory. The States General having been conceded, who should predominate in that assembly. The king could no longer refuse to convoke them, but he had still the power to determine the form they were to assume. 175 years had elapsed since their last meeting. They had become a mere indistinct tradition. None knew precisely what should be the number of the deputies, the mutual relations of the three orders, the mode of election, the forms of deliberation. The king alone could have settled these questions. He did not settle them. After having allowed the disputed powers, which he sought to retain, to be snatched away from him, he failed to use those which were not disputed. M. de Brienne, the first minister, had strange notions on this subject, and caused his master to adopt a resolution unparalleled in history. He regarded the questions whether the electoral franchise was to be universal or limited, whether the assembly was to be numerous or restricted, whether the orders were to be separated or united, whether they were to be equal or unequal in their rights, as a matter of erudition. Consequently, an order in council commanded all the constituted bodies of the realm to make researches as to the structure of this old States General and the forms used by them, and added that His Majesty invited all the learned persons of the kingdom, more especially those who belonged to the Academy of Belles Lettres and Antiquities, to address to the keeper of the seals papers and information on this subject. Thus was the constitution of the country treated like an academical essay put up to competition. The call was heard, all the local powers deliberated on the answer to be given to the king. All the corporate bodies put in their claims. All classes endeavored to rake up from the ruins of the old States General the forms which seemed best adapted to secure their own peculiar interests. Everyone had something to say, and as France was the most literary country in Europe, there was a deluge of publications. The conflict of classes was inevitable, but that conflict which should naturally have been reserved for the States General themselves, where it might have been kept within bounds when it arose on given questions, finding a boundless field before it, and being fed by general controversy, speedily assumed a degree of strange boldness and excessive violence, to be accounted for by the secret excitement of the public mind, but which no external symptom had as yet prepared men for. Between the time when the king renounced his absolute authority and the commencement of the elections about 5 months elapsed. In this interval little was changed in the actual state of things, but the movement which was driving the French nation to a total subversion of society dashed onwards with increasing velocity. At first nothing was talked of but the constitution of the States General. Big books were hastily filled with crude erudition, in which an attempt was made to reconcile the traditions of the Middle Ages with the demands of the present time. Then the question of the old States General was dropped. This heap of mouldy precedents was flung aside, and it was asked what, on general and abstract principles, the legislative power ought to be. At each step the horizon extended beyond the constitution of the legislature. The discussion embraced the whole framework of government. Beyond the frame of government the whole fabric of society was to be shaken to its foundations. At first men spoke of a better ponderation of powers, a better adjustment of the rights of classes, but soon they advanced, they hurried, they rushed to pure democracy. At first Montesquieu was cited and discussed. At last Rousseau was the only authority. He and he alone became and was to remain the teacher of the first age of the Revolution. The old regime was still in complete existence, and already the institutions of England were deemed superannuated and inadequate. The root of every incident that followed was implanted in men's minds. Scarcely an opinion was professed in the whole course of the Revolution which might not already be traced in its germ. There was not an idea realized by the Revolution that some theory had not at once reached and even surpassed. In all things the majority of numbers is to give the law. Such was the keynote of the whole controversy. Nobody dreamed that the concession of political rights could be determined by any other element than that of number. What can be more absurd, exclaims a writer who was one of the most moderate of the time, than that a body which has 20 millions of heads should be represented in the same manner as one which has 100,000. After having shown that there were in France 80,000 ecclesiastics and about 120,000 nobles, Sieyès merely adds, compare this number of these 200,000 privileged persons to that of 26 million souls, and judge the question. The most timid among the innovators of the Revolution, those who wished that the reasonable prerogatives of the different orders should be respected, talked nevertheless as if there were neither class nor order, and still took the numerical majority as the sole basis of their calculations. Everybody framed his own statistics, but all was statistical. The relation of privileged persons to those not privileged, said Lafont, le débat, is as 1 to 22. According to the city of Bourg, the commons formed 19/20ths of the population. According to the city of Nimes, 29/30ths. It was, as you see, a mere question of figures. From this political arithmetic, Volney deduced as a natural consequence universal suffrage. Rue de Ré, universal eligibility. Pétion, the unity of the assembly. Many of these writers, in drawing out their figures, knew nothing of the quotient, and the calculation frequently led them beyond their hopes and even beyond their wishes. The most striking thing at this passionate epoch was not so much the passions which broke forth as the power of the opinions that prevailed. And the opinion that prevailed above all others was that not only there were no privileges, but even that there were no private rights. Even those who professed the largest consideration for privileges and private rights considered such privileges and rights as wholly indefensible. not only those exercised in their own time, but those existing at any time and in any country. The conception of a temperate and ponderated government, that is to say, of a government in which the different classes of society and the different interests which divide them balance each other, in which men are weighed not only as individuals, but by reason of their property, their patronage, and their influence in the scale of the common weal. These conceptions were wanting in the mind of the multitude. They were replaced by the notion of a crowd consisting of similar elements, and they were superseded by votes, not as the representatives of interests or of persons, but of numerical force. Another thing well worthy of remark in this singular movement of the mind was its pace, at first so easy and regulated, at last so headlong and impetuous. A few months' interval marked this difference. Read what was written in the first weeks of 1788 by the keenest opponents of the old regime. You will be struck by the forbearance of their language. Then take the publications of the most moderate reformers in the last 5 months of the same year. You will find them revolutionary. The government had challenged discussion on itself. No bounds, therefore, would be set to the theme. The same impulse which had been given to opinion soon drove the passions of the nation with furious rapidity in the same direction. At first the Commons complained that the nobility carried their rights too far. Later on, the existence of any such rights was denied. At first it was proposed to share power with the upper classes. Soon all power was refused to them. The aristocracy was to become a sort of extraneous substance in the uniform texture of the nation. Some said the privileged classes were 100,000, some that they were 500,000. All agreed in thinking that they formed a mere handful of foreign to the rest of the nation, only to be tolerated in the interest of public tranquillity. Take away in your imagination, said Rabot Saint-Étienne, the whole of the clergy, take away even the whole nobility, there still remains the nation. The Commons were a complete social body. All the rest was vain superfluity. Not only the nobles had no right to be masters of the rest, they had scarcely the right to be their fellow citizens. For the first time, perhaps, in the history of the world, the upper classes had separated and isolated themselves to such a degree from all other classes that their members could be counted one by one and set apart like sheep drafted from a flock. Whilst the middle classes were bent on not mixing with the class above them, but on the contrary stood carefully aloof from all contact. These two symptoms, had they been understood, would have revealed the immensity of the revolution which was about to take place, or rather which was already made. Now follow the movement of passion in the track of opinion. At first hatred was expressed against privileges, none against persons, but by degrees the tone becomes more bitter. Emulation becomes jealousy, enmity becomes detestation. 1,000 conflicting associations are piled together to form the mighty mass which 1,000 arms are at once to lift and drop upon the head of the aristocracy, so as to crush it. The privileged ranks were attacked in countless publications. They were defended in so few that it is somewhat difficult to ascertain what was said in their favor. It may seem surprising that the assailed classes, holding most of the great offices of state and owning a large portion of the land of the country, should have found so few defenders, though so many eloquent voices have pleaded their cause since they have been conquered, decimated, ruined. But this is explained by the extreme confusion into which the aristocracy was thrown when the rest of the nation, having proceeded for a time in the track marked out by itself, suddenly turned against it. With astonishment it perceived that opinions used to attack it were its own opinions. The notions which compassed its annihilation were familiar to its own mind. What had been the amusement of aristocratic leisure became a terrible weapon against aristocratic society. In common with their adversaries, these nobles were ready enough to believe that the most perfect form of society would be that most nearly akin to the natural equality of man, in which merit alone, and not either birth or fortune, should determine rank, and in which government would be a simple contract, and law the creation of a numerical majority. They knew nothing of politics but what they had read in books, and in the same books. The only difference was that one party was bent on trying a great social experiment which must be made at the expense of the other party. But though their interests were different, their opinions were the same. Those same patricians would have made the revolution if they had been born plebeians. When, therefore, they suddenly found themselves attacked, they were singularly embarrassed in their defence. Not one of them had ever considered by what means an aristocracy may justify its privileges in the eyes of the people. They knew not what to say in order to show how it is that an aristocracy can alone preserve the people from oppression of the crown, and the calamities of revolution, insomuch that the privileges apparently established in the sole interest of those who possess them do constitute the best security that can be found for the tranquillity and prosperity even of those who are without them. All these arguments, which are so familiar to those who have a long experience of public affairs and who have acquired the science of government, were to those nobles of France novel and unknown. Instead of this, they spoke of the services which their forefathers had rendered 600 years ago, of the superstitious veneration due to a past which was now detested, of the necessity of a nobility to uphold the honor of arms and the traditions of military valor. In opposition to a proposal to admit the peasantry to the franchise in the provincial assemblies, and even to preside over those bodies, M. de Bazancourt, a councillor of state, declared that the kingdom of France was based upon honor and prerogative. So great was the ignorance of, and so deep the obscurity in which absolute power had concealed the real laws of society, even from the eyes of those to whom it was most interested in making them known. The language of the nobles was often arrogant, because they were accustomed to be the first, but it was irresolute, because they doubted of their own right. Who can depict the endless divisions in the bosom of the assailed parties? The spirit of rivalry and contention raged amongst those who were thus isolated themselves. The nobles against the priests, the first voice raised to demand the confiscation of the property of the clergy, was that of a noble. The priest against the nobles, the lesser nobility against the great lords, the parish priest against the bishops. The discussion roused by the king's edicts, after having run round a vast circumference of institutions and laws, always ended at the two following points, which practically express the objects of the contest. 1. In the States General then about to meet, were the Commons to have a greater number of representatives than each of the two other orders, so that the total number of its deputies should be equal to those of the nobility and clergy combined. 2. Were the orders to deliberate together or separately. This reduplication of the Commons and the fusion of the three orders in one assembly appeared at the time to be things less novel and less important than they were in reality. Some minor circumstances which had long existed, or were then in existence, concealed their novelty and their magnitude. For ages the provincial estates of Languedoc had been composed and had sat in this manner, with no other result than that of giving to the middle class a larger share of public business, and of creating common interests and greater facility of intercourse between that class and the two higher orders. This example had been copied subsequently in the 2 or 3 provincial assemblies which were held in 1779. Instead of dividing the classes, it had been found to draw them together. The king himself appeared to have declared in favor of this system, for he had just applied it to the provincial assemblies, which the last edict had called into being in all the provinces, having previously no estates of their own, 1788. It was still imperfectly seen, without a clear perception of the fact, that an institution which had only modified the ancient constitution of the country when established in a single province could not fail to bring about its total and violent overthrow the moment it was applied to the whole state. It was evident that the Commons, if equal in number to the two other orders in the General Assembly of the nation, must instantly preponderate there, not as participating in their business, but as the supreme master of it. For the Commons would stand united between two bodies not only divided against each other, but divided against themselves. The commons having the same interests, the same passions, the same object, the two other orders having different interests, different objects, and frequently different passions, these having the current of public opinion in their favor, those having it against them. This preference from without could not fail to drive a certain number of nobles and priests to join the commons, so that whilst it banded all the commons together, it detached from the nobility and the clergy all those who were aiming at popularity or seeking to track out a new road to power. In the states of Languedoc, it was common to see the commons forsake their own body to vote with the nobles and the bishops, because the established influence of aristocracy, still prevailing in their opinions and manners, weighed upon them. But here the reverse necessarily occurred, and the commons necessarily found themselves in a majority, although the number of their own representatives was the same. The action of such a party in the assembly could not fail to be not only preponderating but violent, for it was sure to encounter there all that could excite the passions of man. To bring parties to live together in a conflict of opposite opinions is no easy task, but to enclose in the same arena political bodies, already formed, completely organized, each having its proper origin, its past, its traditions, its peculiar usages, its spirit of union, to plant them apart, always in presence of each other, and to compel them to carry on an incessant debate with no medium between them, is not to provoke discussion but war. Moreover, this majority, inflamed by its own passions and the passions of its antagonists, was all-powerful. Nothing could, I will not say arrest, but retard its movements, for nothing remained to check it but the power of the crown, already disarmed and inevitably destined to yield to the strain of a single assembly concentrated against itself. This was not to transpose gradually the balance of power, but to upset it. It was not to impart to the commons a share in the exorbitant rights of the aristocracy, but suddenly to transfer unbounded power to other hands, to abandon the guidance of affairs to a single passion, a single idea, a single interest. This was not a reform, but a revolution. Mounier, who alone among the reformers of that time seems to have settled in his own mind what it was he wished to effect, and what were the conditions of a regular and free government. Mounier, who in his plan of government had divided the three orders, was nevertheless favorable to this union of them, and for this reason, that what was wanted before all things was an assembly to destroy the remains of the old constitution, all special privileges and all local privileges, which could never be done with an upper house composed of the nobles and the clergy. It would seem, at any rate, that the reduplication of the votes of the commons and the fusion of the three orders in one body must have been questions inseparable from each other, for to what end should the number of representatives of the commons be augmented, if that branch of the assembly was to debate and vote apart from the other two? M. Necker thought proper to separate these questions. No doubt he desired both the reduplication of the commons and that the three orders should vote together. It is very probable that the king leaned in the same direction by the aristocracy he had just been conquered. It was the aristocracy which pressed him hardest, which had roused the other classes against the royal authority, and had led them to victory. These blows had been felt, and the king had not sufficient penetration to perceive that his adversaries would soon be compelled to defend him, and that his friends would become his masters. Louis XVI, therefore, like his minister, was inclined to constitute the States General in the manner which the commons desired. But they were afraid to go so far. They stopped halfway, not from any clear perception of their danger, but confused by the inarticulate clamor around them. What man or what class has ever had the penetration to see when it became necessary to come down from a lofty pinnacle in order to avoid being hurled down from it? It was then decided that the commons should return twice as many members as each of the other orders, but the question of the vote in common was left unsettled. Of all courses of action, this was certainly the most dangerous. Nothing contributes more to the maintenance of despotism than the division and mutual rivalry of classes. Absolute power lives on them. on condition, however, that these divisions are confined to a pacific bitterness, that men envy their neighbors without excessive hatred, and that these classes, though separated, are not in arms. But every government must perish in the midst of a violent collision of classes, when once they have begun to make war on each other. No doubt it was very late in the day to seek to maintain the old constitution of the States General, even if it were reformed. But this resolution, however rash, was supported by the law of the land, which had still some authority. The government had tradition in its favor, and still had its hand upon the instrument of the law. If the double number of the commons and the vote of the three orders in common had been conceded at once, no doubt a revolution would have been made, but it would have been made by the Crown, which by pulling down these old institutions itself might have deadened their fall. The upper classes must have submitted to an inevitable necessity, borne in by the pressure of the Crown, simultaneously with that of the Commons. They would at once have acknowledged their inability to resist. Despairing of their own ascendancy, they would only have contended for equal rights, and would have learnt the lesson of fighting to save something instead of fighting to retain everything. Would it not have been possible to do throughout France what was actually done by the three orders in Dauphiny? In that province the provincial estates chose by a general vote the representatives of the three orders to the States General. Each order in the provincial state had been elected separately and stood for itself alone, but all the orders combined to name the deputies to the States General, so that every noble had commoners amongst its constituents, and every commoner nobles. The three representations, though remaining distinct, thus acquired a certain resemblance. Could not the same thing have been done elsewhere than in Dauphiny? If the orders had been constituted in this manner, might they not have coexisted in a single assembly without coming to a violent collision? Too much weight must not be given to these legislative expedients. The ideas and passions of man, not the mechanism of law, are the motive force of human affairs. Doubtless whatever steps had at that time been taken to form and regulate the assemblies of the nation, it may be thought that war would have broken forth in all its violence between classes. Their animosities were perhaps already too fierce for them to have worked in harmony, and the power of the king was already too weak to compel them to agree. But it must be admitted that nothing could have been done more calculated than what was done to render the conflict between them instantaneous and mortal. Could the utmost art, skill, and deliberate design have brought all this to pass more surely than was actually done by inexperience and temerity? An opportunity had been afforded to the commons to take courage, to prepare for the encounter, and to count their numbers. Their moral ardor had immoderately increased, and had doubled the weight of their party. They had been allured by every hope. They were intimidated by every fear. Victory had been flaunted before their eyes, not given, but they were invited to seize it. After having left the two classes for 5 months to exasperate their old hatreds and repeat the long story of their grievances until they were inflamed against each other with furious resentment, they were arrayed face to face, and the first question they had to decide was one which included all other questions. On that issue alone they might have settled at once, and in a single day, all their quarrels. What strikes one most in the affairs of the world is not so much the genius of those who made the revolution, because they desired it, as the singular imbecility of those who made it without desiring it. Not so much the part played by great men as the influence frequently exercised by the smallest personages in history. When I survey the French Revolution, I am amazed at the immense magnitude of the event, at the glare it has cast to the extremities of the earth, at the power of it, which has more or less been felt by all nations. If I turn to the court, which had so great a share in the Revolution, I perceive there some of the most trivial scenes in history. A king who had no greatness save that of his virtues, and those not the virtues of a king. Harebrained or narrow-minded ministers, dissolute priests, rash or money-seeking courtiers, futile women, who held in their hands the destinies of the human race. Yet these paltry personages set going, push on, precipitate prodigious events. They themselves have little share in them. They themselves are mere accidents. They might almost pass for primal causes, and I marvel at the almighty power which with levers as short as these can set rolling the mass of human society. End of section 33. Section 34 of The State of Society in France Before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 6. The preparation of the instructions to the members of the States General drove the conception of a radical revolution home to the mind of the people. Almost all the institutions of the Middle Ages had a stamp of boldness and truth. Those laws were imperfect, but they were sincere. They had little art, but they had less cunning. They always gave all the rights they seemed to promise. When the commons were convoked to form part of the assemblies of the nation, they were at the same time invested with unbounded freedom in making known their complaints and in sending up their requests. In the cities which were to send deputies to the States General, the whole people was called upon to say what it thought of the abuses to be corrected and the demands to be made. None were excluded from the right of complaint, and any man might express his grievance in his own way. The means were as simple as the political device was bold. Down to the States General of 1614, in all the towns, and even in Paris, a large box was placed in the market-place, with a slit in it to receive the papers and opinions of all men, which a committee sitting at the Hôtel de Ville was empowered to sift and examine. Out of all these diverse remonstrances a bill was drawn up, which expressed the public grievances and the complaint of each individual. The physical and social constitution of that time was based on such deep and solid foundations that this sort of public inquest could take place without shaking it. There was no question of changing the principle of the laws, but simply of putting them straight. Moreover, what were then styled the commons were the burgesses of certain towns. The people of the towns might enjoy an entire liberty in the expression of their wrongs, because they were not in a condition to enforce redress. They exercised without inconvenience that amount of democratic freedom, because in all other respects the aristocracy reigned supreme. The communities of the Middle Ages were aristocratic bodies which merely contained, and this contributed to their greatness, some small fragments of democracy. In 1789, the commons who were to be represented in the States General no longer consisted of the burgesses of the towns alone, as was the case in 1614, but of 20 millions of peasants scattered over the whole area of the kingdom. These had till then never taken any part in public affairs. Political life was not to them even the casual reminiscence of another age. It was in all respects a novelty. Nevertheless, on a given day, the inhabitants of each of the rural parishes of France, collected by the sound of the church bells on the market-place in front of the church, proceeded, for the first time since the commencement of the monarchy, to confer together in order to draw up what was called the cahier of their representatives. In all the countries in which political assemblies are chosen by universal suffrage, no general election takes place which does not deeply agitate the people, unless the freedom of voting be a lie. Here it was not only a universal voting, it was a universal deliberation and inquest. The matter in discussion was not some particular custom or local interest. Each member of one of the greatest nations in the world was asked what he had to say against all the laws and all the customs of his country. I think no such spectacle had been seen before upon the earth. All the peasants of France set to work, therefore, at the same time, to consider among themselves and recapitulate all that they had suffered, all they had to complain of. The spirit of the revolution which excited the citizens of the towns, rushed therefore through 1,000 rills, penetrated the rural population, which was thus agitated in all its parts, and sunk to its very depths. But the form it assumed was not entirely the same. Its shape became peculiar and appropriate to those just affected by it. In the cities it was a cry for rights to be acquired. In the country men thought principally of wants to be satisfied. All the large, general, and abstract theories which fill the minds of the middle classes here took a concrete and definite form. When the peasants came to ask each other what they had to complain of, they cared not for the balance of powers, the guarantees of political freedom, the abstract rights of man or of citizens. They dwelt at once on objects more special and nearer to themselves, which each of them had to endure. One thought of the feudal dues which had taken half his last year's crop, another of the days of forced labor on which he had been compelled to work without wages. One spoke of the Lord's pigeons which had picked his seed from the ground before it sprouted, another of the rabbits which had nibbled his green corn. As their excitement grew by the mutual relation of their wretchedness, all these different evils seemed to them to proceed not so much from institutions as from that single person who still called them his subjects, though he had long ceased to govern them, who was the creature of privileges without obligations, and retained none of his political rights but that of living at their cost, and they more and more agreed in considering him as their common enemy. Providence, which had resolved that the spectacle of our passions and our calamities should be the lesson of the world, permitted the commencement of the Revolution to coincide with a great scarcity and an extraordinary winter. The harvest of 1788 was short, and the first months of the winter of 1789 were marked by cold of unparalleled severity. A frost, like that which is felt in the northern extremity of Europe, hardened the earth to a great depth. For 2 months the whole of France lay hidden under a thick fall of snow, like the steppes of Siberia. The atmosphere was congealed, the sky dull and sad, and this accident of nature gave a gloomier and fiercer tone to the passions of man. All the grievances which might be urged against the institutions of the country and those who rule by those institutions were felt more bitterly amidst the cold and want that prevailed. And when the peasant left his scarcely burning hearth and his chill and naked abode, with a famished and frozen family, to meet his fellows and discuss their common condition of life, it cost him no effort to discover the cause of all his calamities, and he fancied that he could easily, if he dared, put his finger on the source of all his wrongs. End of section 34. Section 35 of the State of Society in France before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 3, Chapter 7. How, on the eve of the convocation of the National Assembly, the mind of the nation was more enlarged, and its spirit raised. 2 questions had thus far divided all classes, that of the reduplication of the commons, and that of the voting of the orders in one body. The first was settled, the second was postponed. That great assembly which every man had regarded in his own heart as the fulfillment of his hopes, and which all had demanded with equal fervor, was about to meet. The event had long been anticipated. To the last it seemed doubtful. It came at length. Preparation was passing into reality, speech into action. At that solemn moment all paused to consider the greatness of the undertaking, near enough to discern the bearing of what was to be done, and to measure the effort which the work required. Nobles, clergy, and citizens alike distinctly perceived that the object was not to modify this or that law, but to remodel all laws, to breathe a new spirit into them, to impart to all of them new purposes and a new course. No one knew as yet exactly what would be destroyed or what would be created, but all felt that immense ruins would be made and immense structures raised. Nor was this the limit of public confidence. None doubted that the destiny of mankind was engaged in the work about to be accomplished. Nowadays, when the calamity of revolutions has rendered us so humble that we scarcely believe ourselves worthy of the freedom enjoyed by other nations, it is difficult to form a conception of the proud anticipations of our sires. The literature of the time shows to our amazement the vast opinions which the French of all ranks had at that time conceived of their country and of their race. Amongst the schemes of reform just brought to light, hardly any were formed on the model of foreign imitation. They were not received as lessons from the British Constitution or borrowed from the experience of American democracy. Nothing was to be copied, nothing was to be done that was not new. Everything was to be different and more perfect than had been seen before. The confidence of the French in themselves and in the superiority of their own reason was unbounded, a great cause of their mistakes, but also of their inimitable energy. What was applicable to themselves alone would be equally applicable to all men. Not a Frenchman but was convinced that not only was the government of France to be changed, but new principles of government were to be introduced into the world, applicable to all the nations of the earth, and destined to regenerate the sum of human affairs. Every man imagined that he held in his hand not only the fate of his country, but that of his species. All believed that there existed for mankind, whatever might be their condition, but one sovereign method of government, dictated by reason. The same institutions were held to be good for all countries and for any people. Whatever government was not approved by the human reason was to be destroyed and superseded by the logical institutions to be adopted, first by the French and afterwards by the human race. The magnitude, the beauty, and the risks of such an enterprise captivated and ravished the imagination of the whole French people. In presence of this immense design, each individual completely forgot himself. The illusion lasted but for a moment, but that moment was perhaps unexampled in the existence of any people. The educated classes had nothing of the timorous and servile spirit which they have since learnt from revolutions. For some time past they had ceased to fear the power of the crown. They had not yet learned to dread the power of the people. The grandeur of their design rendered them intrepid. Reforms already accomplished had caused a certain amount of private suffering. To this they were resigned. The reforms which were inevitable must alter the condition of thousands of human beings. That was not thought of. The uncertainty of the future had already checked the course of trade and paralyzed the exertions of industry. Neither privations nor suffering extinguished their ardor. All these private calamities disappeared in the eyes even of those who suffered by them in the splendor of the common enterprise. The love of well-being, which was one day to reign supreme over all other passions, was then but a subordinate and feeble predilection. Men aimed at loftier pleasures. Every man was resolved in his heart to sacrifice himself for so great a cause, and to grudge neither his time nor his property nor his life. I hasten to record these virtues of our forefathers, for the present age, which is already incapable of imitating them, will soon be incapable of understanding them. At that time the nation, in every rank, sought to be free. To doubt its ability for self-government would have seemed a strange impertinence, and no phrase-maker of the day would have dared to tell the people that, for their own happiness and safety, their hands must be tied and their authority placed in leading strings. Ere they can listen to such language, nations must be reduced to think more humbly of themselves. The passions which had just been so violently excited between the various classes of society seemed of themselves to cool down at the moment when, for the first time in 2 centuries, these classes were about to act together. All had demanded with equal fervor the restoration of the great assembly, then new-born. Each of them saw in that event the means of realizing its fondest hopes. The States General were to meet at last. A common gladness filled those divided hearts and knit them together for an instant before they separated for ever. All minds were struck by the peril of disunion. A sovereign effort was made to agree. Instead of dwelling on the causes of difference, men applied themselves to consider what all alike desired: the destruction of arbitrary power, the self-government of the nation, the recognition of the rights of every citizen, liberty of the press, personal freedom, the mitigation of the law, a stronger administration of justice, religious toleration, the abolition of restraint on labor and human industry. These were all things demanded by all. This, at least, was remembered. This was a ground of common rejoicing. I think no epoch of history has seen, on any spot on the globe, so large a number of men so passionately devoted to the public good, so honestly forgetful of themselves, so absorbed in the contemplation of the common interest, so resolved to risk all they cherished in life to secure it. This it is which gave to the opening of the year 1789 an incomparable grandeur. This was the general source of passion, courage, and patriotism, from which all the great deeds of the Revolution took their rise. The scene was a short one, but it will never depart from the memory of mankind. The distance from which we look back to it is not the only cause of its apparent greatness. It seemed as great to all those who lived in it. All foreign nations saw it, hailed it, were moved by it. There is no corner of Europe so secluded that the glow of admiration and of hope did not reach it. In the vast series of memoirs left to us by the contemporaries of the Revolution, I've met with none in which the recollection of the first days of 1789 has not left imperishable traces. Everywhere it kindled the freshness, clearness, and vivacity of the impressions of youth. I venture to add that there is but one people on the earth which could have played this part. I know my country. I know but too well its mistakes, its faults, its foibles, and its sins. But I know, too, of what it is capable. There are undertakings which the French nation can alone accomplish. There are magnanimous resolutions which this nation can alone conceive. France alone may, on some given day, take in hand the common cause and stand up in defense of it. And if she be subject to awful reverses, she has also moments of sublime enthusiasm which bear her aloft to heights which no other people will ever reach. End of section 35. End of The State of Society in France Before the Revolution of 1789 by Alexis de Tocqueville.